There is a type of encounter that does not begin with a touch, nor with a word. It begins with a recognized silence, an instant in which two gazes, still childish, lock not by chance, but by a strange and quiet certainty. Ah, you too. It was summer. He was 12, she was 10, and the world, in its infinite haste, did not notice the small tremor that marked the beginning of everything, and of the long, long waiting that would follow. If this is the atmosphere that captivates you, stories where desire is a whisper and love is a deeply intelligent patience, subscribe to the channel, stay until the end, because the true reunion is always worth the wait. The summer drawing room of the Worthington estate was a vast social battlefield disguised as idleness. The air, heavy with the scent of roses and rice powder, hummed with the monotonous melody of adult conversations, politics, harvests, other people's marriages. For Samuel Worthington, third son of the Viscount of Alderley, son of a lineage that would give him more obligations than titles, that was another day of mandatory discomfort, a sort of golden cage where one learned, above all, the art of not appearing bored. He had taken refuge in the recess of the French window, a geography book open, but unread upon his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon line beyond the gardens. He preferred the company of the clouds to that of the guests. It was thus that he first saw her, not as a person, but as an interruption in the predictable pattern of the afternoon. A girl, sitting alone on an iron bench under the shadow of an ancient oak. She was not playing. She did not seem to be waiting for anyone. She simply existed with a stillness that defied the buzz of the house. Her dress was of a simple blue, without the excessive lace of the other children, and her hair, of a brown so dark it almost appeared black, was tied back in a practical, not decorative manner. There was something about her, a serenity, a completeness in her solitude, that captured Samuel's attention without him knowing how to explain why. Curiosity, in that world, was an impulse to be tamed, but he was a boy of 12, and the rule was broken for an instant. He observed her. She held a book, but her eyes were fixed on a distant point on the lavender beds. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were whispering to herself, or perhaps reciting something. Samuel frowned. What was she? Hearing that no one else heard, he lost himself in his thoughts for a few minutes. Social pressure, however, was an implacable force. His mother, with a look that was a silent command, indicated it was time to greet the new guests, a Scottish widow and her daughter, passing through the region. Samuel squared his shoulders, swallowed his sigh, and followed, his face assuming the polished mask of courtesy. It was only when he stood before them that the world seemed to slow down, to adjust its focus. The widow Finch spoke with the soft voice of one who carries a long history, and by her side, standing with a posture that was not rigid but most dignified, was the girl from the garden. "Lady Worthington, allow me to present my daughter, Eleanor Finch," said the widow. Eleanor. The name rang in the air like a different musical note. She made a small curtsy, neither too deep nor too shallow, the perfect movement. When she raised her face, her eyes met Samuel's. They were of a greyish green like the sea before a storm, and in them there was no nervous sparkle or the affectation he was accustomed to seeing. There was only a calm observation, so intense that Samuel felt, for a second, completely stripped of his title, his manners, of everything. She did not smile. She simply saw. "Miss Finch," he murmured, bowing as well, the formality suddenly sounding hollow and absurd. The rest of the afternoon unfolded beneath the clear surface of rules. The children were dismissed to the garden under the distant watch of a governess. A group formed for a game of archery, with loud voices and shrill laughter. Samuel, by habit, kept to the sidelines, and he noticed that Eleanor did the same, a few steps ahead of him, now leafing through her book in earnest. It was by chance, or perhaps the subtle geography of lonely souls, that placed them side by side, minutes later, in the small summer library annexed to the drawing room. She was looking for a specific work on the lower shelves. He, feigning interest in an atlas, observed her from the corner of his eye. "Are you lost?" His voice came out before prudence could contain it. She turned slowly, without startle. "No, merely checking if there is more than one translation of Ovid here. The one I have is inadequate." The response was so unexpected, so specific, that Samuel stood still, a girl of 10, concerned with the quality of a Latin poet's translation. "Inadequate how?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Like a dress that does not fit," she said, and for the first time a glimpse of something akin to humor touched the corner of her mouth. "It covers the story, but does not clothe it. It does not let you feel the texture of the words." Samuel felt a strange warmth rise up his neck. That was a conversation, a real conversation, not about the weather or horses. "Mine is Dryden's," he offered, pointing to a higher shelf. "They say it is accurate, but a bit rigid." She followed his finger with her gaze, then looked back at him. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was full. It was the space where two intellectual curiosities recognized and bowed to one another. "Rigid can be good," she pondered, her voice low and clear. "For some structures, it is necessary." He fetched the book for her, their fingers almost touching in the transfer of the heavy volume. It was the closest they had been. She smelled of simple soap and old paper. "You always look as if you are listening to something no one else hears," he said, the observation escaping like a sigh, echoing his first impression in the garden. Eleanor pressed the book against her chest, her clear eyes fixing him with a renewed intensity. There was an evaluation there, not of his appearance or status, but of the quality of his attention. She measured his courage in asking such a question, in seeing so much. And then, quite simply, she granted, "The first truth, small and enormous. Perhaps I am." There was no explanation. There was no laughter to diminish the moment. Only the admission, floating in the dusty air of the library, amidst the late afternoon light entering through the window. Samuel did not know what to answer. A true smile untrained touched his lips. He merely nodded. The silence that followed was not heavy, but he felt an urgent desire to fill it with something of her, to prolong due rare thread of connection. "It is strange," he began, his tone deliberately light, "but when I am translating Cicero with my tutor, he always rebukes me for seeking too much musicality in the orations. He says that at Oxford, where I am to go in the future, Latin prose will be the lingua franca of bored diplomats, and that I should worry more about precision than rhythm." He faced her, curious. "What do you think? Precision or music?" The question was an offering. He was not just asking about Latin. He was opening a window into his world of expectations and preparations, and inviting her to give her opinion as an equal. Eleanor's eyes shone, not with sadness, but with a vivid and sharp interest. The mention of Oxford flickered between them like a distant lighthouse of a future that did not include her. After all, girls like her could not attend schools and universities as she wished, but she ignored the shadow for an instant, focusing on the core of his question. That was a mind that questioned, that resisted mere functionality. It was admirable. "So Latin," she said with a smile that was at once tender and thoughtful, "will not be just for deciphering Ovid with me, but for negotiating treaties." There was a hint of melancholy in the question, recognizing the division between the private world they shared and the public one that awaited him. But above all, there was a genuine fascination. "I think your tutor is slightly mistaken. A poorly rhythmed treaty is like a poorly sewn dress. It fulfills its function but convinces no one of its solidity. Precision is in the music, in the pauses, in the cadence. Even Cicero knew that." Samuel stood still, looking at her. No one, not even his expensive tutor, had ever summarized with such clarity and grace the conflict he felt. It was as if she had taken a loose thread in his mind and pulled it, revealing a complete and logical pattern. A wave of admiration, deeper than any feeling he had ever experienced, flooded him. The call of the governess echoed through the corridor, breaking the spell. The afternoon of visits was coming to an end. Eleanor made a small parting curtsy, holding Dryden's book like a treasure, but her gaze still held the glow of due instant of intellectual complicity. "Thank you, Mr. Worthington." "Samuel," he corrected quickly, his voice carrying a new layer of meaning. "When there are no adults around." She inclined her head again, a gesture of acceptance. "Eleanor," and she was gone, her blue dress vanishing into the shadows of the corridor, taking with her the peculiar silence that enveloped her, the strange clarity she had brought to the library, and now the reverberation of a mind that saw the world through a lens as sharp and poetic as his own. Samuel remained standing, looking at the space she had occupied. The buzz of the drawing room seemed more distant, more irrelevant than ever. Something very small and very important had happened. No heart raced, no promise was made. No love in the sense the world shouted was born. Recognition was born. The seed of an affinity was planted in silent and fertile soil, watered by an unpretentious curiosity and a rare intellectual honesty. He saw her. She saw him back. And in the space between those two gazes, an invisible bridge was built, fragile as a spider's web in that summer, but destined to bear the weight of many winters to come. Samuel returned to the window. The horizon was the same, and yet everything felt different. The world was no longer just a place to be endured. There was in it now a point of quiet and intelligent resonance, a blue point under an oak tree, with a book and a secret in her eyes. He did not know then that he was learning the language of waiting. He learned only to recognize the only person with whom silence was not a solitude. Summers became a particular emotional geography for Samuel. The Worthington estate was no longer just his home, but a map where a single point radiated heat, wherever Eleanor Finch happened to be. She and her mother, the Scottish widow, became regular visitors, favored by a growing friendship between Lady Worthington and Mrs. Finch. For Samuel, now with his 15th year nearly turning 16, this meant something rare. Time. Time for the seed planted in childhood, not only to germinate, but to take root. Their connection was not forced. It was woven, thread by thread, in moments stolen in plain sight, and therefore invisible. They were not children, but they were also not adults, by the world's terms. They stood at GUU's strange threshold, where ideas already had wings, but bodies were still bound by convention. A particularly hot July afternoon saw the young people of the house and the visitors dispatched to the gardens with the instruction to take the air, while the adults discussed politics in the shade. An improvised cricket match began on the south lawn. Samuel, by habit, declined. He searched with his gaze for the figure he knew would also flee the noise. He found her by the edge of the ornamental pond, sitting on a smooth rock, her simple shoes placed to the side, her bare feet almost touching the water. She was not reading, she was simply watching the swans glide, her serious and pensive profile set against the shimmer of the water. Her moss-colored linen dress was simple, but in it she seemed more a part of the landscape than anyone on the lawn. They never seemed to be in a hurry. Samuel's voice made her turn her face, but it did not startle her. Her eyes, of that rare grey tone that he already mentally catalogued in different shades according to the light, met his. Why should they be? The water carries them where they need to go without effort. A good argument for idleness, he joked, drawing near. Not idleness. Flow, she corrected softly. There is a difference. One is static. The other is trusting the current. Samuel sat on the grass at a polite distance, but close enough for the conversation to be intimate. The sound of laughter from the cricket match seemed distant, from another world. And you? Do you trust the current? He asked, plucking a blade of grass. Eleanor looked at the water, her face a mixture of deep thought and a slight melancholy. My mother says that women of our position do not have currents. We have tracks, very well-defined ones. Bisset. Observation was heavy for a summer afternoon, but it came from her with naturalness. Samuel felt a knot of frustration, the first sting of something protective and fierce. Tracks can lead to interesting places. Yes, she agreed, looking back at him, but they do not allow for detours. And what if the most interesting place is a detour? The air between them seemed to vibrate with the unasked question. Samuel had no answer. Instead, he changed the subject, or perhaps deepened it. What were you hearing before I arrived? You had that expression. A slight smile touched her lips. Do you still insist on that theory? Perhaps I was merely listening to the silence. Does silence have a sound? The deepest of all, she said, and her tone was not pretentious, it was confidential. The sound of things growing, of grass stretching toward the sun, of thoughts organizing themselves. It is a whisper. He observed her, truly observed her, as he had on the first day. But now he saw layers. He saw the intelligence that inhabited that serene face, a mind that perceived the world in metaphors and nuances, not in raw facts. He saw the soft curve of her neck, where a few strands of dark hair had escaped her simple bun. He saw her hands resting in her lap, long and delicate, one of them tracing small circles on the fabric of her dress. There was a beauty in her that was not just of the face, but of the being that inhabited it. It was a beauty that awakened. Something confused in him, a desire to protect her, yes, but also to understand her, to inhabit that silent and observant world by her side. "You speak like a philosophical naturalist," he commented, trying to keep the tone light. She laughed softly, a rare and precious sound. "Or like a young woman with too much imagination and too much time to think." "Is it not the same thing?" he retorted, and the smile she returned was more open, reaching her eyes. It was a tiny and glorious, a victory. Eleanor then did something unexpected. She rose and with a natural gesture walked along the bank, examining the plants by the water's edge. "Look here," she called, and he stood to follow her. "This small white flower, soapwort. The old washerwomen used its leaves to make soap. It is strong enough to clean away dirt, yet so delicate to the touch." Samuel watched her as she spoke, her face illuminated by genuine interest. He noticed everything, the way her fingers caressed, the petal without plucking it, the precise vocabulary, the connection she made between botany and human history. She was a prodigy, yes, but a human one, whose knowledge was tempered by a tactile and poetic curiosity. "How do you know this?" he asked, marveled. "My Italian grandmother," she replied, moving to another plant. "She knew the uses of everything that grew. She said that wisdom is not only in big books, but in small roots." She looked at him over her shoulder. "It is a different way of seeing the world than yours, I suppose. Less about maps of empires, more about maps of meanings." "Maps of empires are important," he said, defending the subject his tutor hammered into his head. "They define borders, wars, trade. And maps of meanings define life within those borders," she countered gently, without confrontation. "What people eat, how they heal their sick, what stories they tell about flowers. Without one, the other is empty." Samuel fell silent. No one, not even his tutors, nor his father, much less his brothers, had ever put things that way. It was as if she were giving him a new lens through which to look at the world, a lens that made everything richer, more connected. "You should write that down," he said finally. "Your book of meanings." She stopped and stared at him, surprised. Her face softened in a new way. "Do you think so?" "Yes. It would be more valuable than many of the political treatises we have to memorize." It was an intellectual compliment, the highest he could conceive, and the effect on Eleanor was visible. Her face flushed slightly, and she looked away, but not before he saw the spark of gratitude and complicity. They were on the same side, the side of ideas, of curiosity, of the world seen from an angle that few shared. In the encounters that followed throughout that summer and the next, this pattern became firm. They were companions in thought, on walks through the woods, always with Miss Bell or another chaperone at a respectable but non-intrusive distance. Eleanor would point out mushrooms, explain the symbiosis between trees, and recite verses in Italian that spoke of the very landscape they saw. Samuel, in turn, told her about the tensions between the nations he studied, the mechanics of new inventions, the logic of navigation, and he always observed her. He made mental notes that she twisted her mother's ring on her finger when she was thinking, deeply, that her truest smile came not from a social grace, but from an intellectually satisfying argument, that she had a small mole, like a beauty mark, just below her right ear, that her voice grew softer, almost a whisper, when she shared something that truly troubled her. And he, being a gentleman, being Samuel, transformed his attention into gestures. It was he who delicately brushed aside a thorny branch from her path, who brought a stool so she could sit in the shade when he noticed a fleeting weariness in her eyes, who once, when a sudden rain caught them in the orchard, immediately took off his coat and offered it, not as a grand gesture, but as a practical act of care. The way their fingers met as he handed her the coat was brief, but the contact, the warmth of her hand beneath the thin glove, remained etched into his skin. "Thank you, Samuel," she had said, and the use of his Christian name there, in the intimacy of the rain, with no witnesses nearby, felt like a treasure. "It is only logic," he had replied, trying to sound nonchalant as the water dripped through his hair. "You are the only one in a silk dress. It is the most vulnerable to water." She wrapped herself in his coat, which covered her completely, and looked at him. "It is always logic with you, isn't it?" Not always, he thought, his heart thumping hard against his ribs. Not always. The conversation that followed, as the rain slowed to a drizzle, veered into more dangerous territory. They spoke, as they often did, of grand ideas, fate, choice, the weight of expectations. But now these abstractions seemed to clothe themselves with their own faces, their own uncertain futures. "Sometimes I feel we are just rehearsing," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on the trembling spiderweb between two branches, perfect and fragile. "Teaching ourselves steps for a ball that will never happen in the ballroom they expect." Samuel watched her. The diffused light of the rainy afternoon softened her features, illuminating the damp strands of her lashes. There was a vulnerability in her he had never seen, a crack in the armor of serenity, and he understood, with a tightening in his chest, that she was not just speaking of herself. "And if the ball," he said, his voice lower than he intended, "is not about the ballroom, but about the music one hears before it begins, the music that only two pairs of ears can catch." Eleanor turned her face toward him slowly. Her eyes met his, and something happened in the air between them. It was not the first time they had gazed at each other, but it was the first time they did so without the shield of intellectual curiosity or social politeness. It was a naked, raw recognition. In it, Samuel saw reflected his own restlessness, his own bewildering wonder at the connection that bound them. He saw a flash of something warm and frightened that perfectly echoed the turmoil inside him. It was as if, for the first time, they were truly seeing one another, without the veils of childhood or the garments of innocence. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was charged, dense, like the moisture in the air before a lightning strike. The arm's length between them seemed both a vast and tiny frontier. Eleanor was the first to lower her eyes, a faint blush on her pale cheeks, but not as a retreat. It was like a surrender to an overwhelming fact. "Some things," she whispered, the words coming out like a torn secret, "should not be named too soon." Samuel felt the truth of it like a low, sweet blow. To name it, the magnetism, the confused attraction, the deep and forming feeling, would be to expose it to the world. It would be to give shape to something that still needed to grow in the shadows, to become strong enough. The answer came from him not as a thought, but as a deep instinct, to protect Gu rare seed. "I agree," he replied, his voice a thread of grave sound. "Some things need to survive first." It was a pact, an understanding sealed in the damp air of the woods. It was then that the world, with its pitiless timing, intervened. Henry appeared in the clearing, his silhouette imposing against the brighter light outside. His face, usually marked by a dry humor, was serious. "Samuel," he called, with a politeness that did not disguise the urgency. He inclined his head toward Eleanor. "Miss Finch, our father requires you. Estate. Matters. Immediately." The mask of formality fell over Samuel like a heavy cloak. His shoulders squared, his expression smoothed into something neutral and acceptable. "With your leave, miss, I must go," he said to Eleanor, his voice now contained and correct. "Of course," she replied, her tone equally polished, her own features recomposing into their habitual elegance. But as he began to turn, Eleanor made a subtle movement. She reached out and touched, with the tips of her gloved fingers, the sleeve of his coat, where a small fragment of moss from the trunk he had leaned against had stuck. She plucked it off with a tiny gesture and held it between her thumb and forefinger. "A souvenir from the woods," she murmured, the words a breath intended only for his ears. The touch was briefer than a blink, light as the petal she had studied days before. But for Samuel, it was as if a thread of fire had raced down his arm, incinerating the fine wool of the coat and marking his skin. It was a gesture of devastating intimacy, a gesture of meticulous care, of attention paid to his smallest details, a gesture that whispered, louder than any declaration, "I see you. I too keep things." "Samuel," Henry's voice came again, a note of real impatience now. He departed, his step quick and determined, but he took with him the indelible image, Eleanor, standing beneath the dripping trees, the small green moss like a jewel between her pale fingers, her eyes, fixed on his back with an expression he did not dare decipher, but which he felt echoing in every accelerated beat of his heart. That night, in their respective rooms, the echo of the woods persisted. In his bed, Samuel incessantly relived the moment, the weight of her gaze, the silent pact of the words left unsaid, the fleeting touch that burned in his memory. A foolish, entirely involuntary smile touched his lips in the dark, but it was soon supplanted by a cold restlessness. Her talk of the ball that would never happen, of the well-defined tracks. Was she referring to her own origins, to her position as the daughter of a widow without significant fortune, of mixed blood, or to his tracks, to the future arrangements his family, in veiled conversations, was already beginning to weave for the third Worthington son? A career, a useful alliance. The image of Eleanor, of her rare smile and her sharp mind, veered painfully away from all those pre-drawn paths. It was a disturbing thought which he pushed away, concentrating only on the warmth of the imaginary souvenir she had left on his sleeve. At the dressing table in the guest house, Eleanor let the comb glide through her long, dark hair, but her movements were mechanical. Her mind was in the woods, in Samuel's grey eyes so serious and deep when they agreed not to name things, in the solidity of his presence by her side, in the practical gentleness that was, she was beginning to suspect, his particular language. A soft flush warmed her cheeks. He was so different, different in the way he listened, the way he thought, the way he simply was. And that difference was a magnet, both alluring and terrifying. "Eleanor, dear." Still awake, her mother's soft voice made her startle slightly. Mrs. Finch entered, wrapped in a dressing gown. "Don't stay up late daydreaming. It was a long and pleasant day at the estate. You need to rest." "Yes, Mother," Eleanor agreed, her dreamy smile shifting into a more contained one. "Just finishing up." "Good. Sleep early. Candlelight tires the eyes." Her mother planted a light kiss on her forehead and withdrew. Alone again, Eleanor blew out the candle. In the darkness, the smile returned, secret and intimate. Her fingers found upon the dressing table the small and fragile piece of moss, kept in a handkerchief. Some things did not need to be named. Some things just needed to survive, silent and warm, in the private space of the heart. And that new sensation, restless and sweet, was strong enough to survive, at least until the next summer. The drawing room of the Worthington mansion was more illuminated than usual. A small chamber music concert, an attempt by Lady Worthington to bring a breath of the London season to the tranquility of the countryside, had gathered a select circle. The young people, relegated to a corner under the watchful eye of the chaperones, talked in groups. But for Samuel, newly turned 16, all the bustle was merely a veil of sound behind which only one person had substance. Eleanor, seated beside her mother and Miss Bell, looked like a delicate engraving in her cream and lavender dress. She followed the music with her eyes, but Samuel had noticed more than once her gaze drifting toward him, very briefly, like the light touch of a feather. There was a tacit agreement between them. On that night, before his departure for a 3-day visit to the estate of a count who was a friend of his father, they would need to find a moment for something that had weighed in his chest for weeks. The opportunity arose during the intermission, when the musicians stepped away for a rest and the guests rose to circulate. Samuel, with a nervousness he disguised under an air of purpose, crossed the room to where she was. "Miss Finch," he greeted, with a perfect bow of the head. "I hope you are enjoying the music." "Very much, Mr. Worthington," she replied, her tone equally polished, but her clear eyes sparkled with a secret knowledge. "There is a matter of a book of poetry, which we discussed last time," he continued, his voice low but clear. "An edition I promised to show you. It is in the library. If Miss Bell could accompany us for a moment." The chaperone, a perceptive woman who had long suspected the singular affection between the two, but who harbored a genuine fondness for Eleanor, pondered for a second before nodding. "5 minutes, Mr. Worthington. The concert will resume shortly." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he led Eleanor through the dimly lit gallery that led to the library. Miss Bell followed at a discreet distance, stopping before the solid wooden door with an expression that was at once permissive and vigilant. She would not enter, but neither would she move away. The atmosphere inside the library was one of sacred silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the almost imperceptible rustle of Eleanor's dress on the Persian rug. The door remained ajar, enough to maintain decorum, but closed enough to grant them a precarious and precious island of privacy. In that space, the mask of formality cracked. Samuel took a deep breath, like one preparing to dive into deep waters. "We have no more than a few minutes before the music resumes," he began, his voice a bit hoarse from the effort of keeping it low. "My father insisted that I accompany Simon to Lord Pembroke's estate. We depart at dawn for 3 days." He paused, his grey eyes fixed on hers, seeking to understand what his next words would cause. "He says it is a preparation, a first step toward being seen in the right circles." Samuel's voice carried a sliver of bitter irony as he repeated his father's phrase. "It is a prelude to Oxford next year. Everything is falling into place." Eleanor's expression did not change dramatically, but Samuel saw. Comprehension hit her like a sudden chill. Her eyes dimmed for a second, not with tears but with the sudden weight of a timeline that was brutally shortening. The 3-day trip ceased to be a mere absence. It became a rehearsal, a somber reminder of the much larger and more formal separation that was approaching like a tide. Their time, which had always seemed an infinite commodity of summers, was abruptly revealed as finite and numbered. "I understand," she whispered, and the two words carried a world of resignation and a sting of pain. She understood more than the words said. The urgency of the moment quadrupled, making every second a stolen treasure. It was in this silent pressure that Samuel acted. "That is why I wanted to give you this now," he said, his voice soft but firm, finally taking the book from its hiding place beneath his coat. It was a small, old volume, bound in leather worn by affection, with the edges of the pages tinged with dull gold. "It is the sonnets, the edition my grandmother gave me, the one I read in the moments that require truth." He held out the book, a tangible piece of his inner world, offered as an anchor against the current that threatened to sweep him away. Eleanor took the book with reverence, her fingers caressing the cover. "Samuel, it is a treasure. I cannot accept something so precious. I fear I cannot accept it. It is too valuable." "I will not accept a refusal," he insisted, his tone soft, but firm. "You must take it, for it is where I have kept something I do not dare keep with me." He opened the book carefully to a page marked by a blue silk ribbon. There, folded with geometric precision and almost transparent from being so thin, was a piece of stationery. "Here." Eleanor touched the paper with her fingertips, a shiver running down her arm. She could feel the texture of the writing on the other side, the grooves left by the pen. "They are only verses," Samuel said, his voice lower, almost husky. "Drafts of thoughts that find no rest on ordinary paper. They do not have the value of the book, but they have the truth that the book lent to me." Eleanor raised her eyes to him, and they were moist, not with sadness, but with a deep and overflowing emotion. The implicit trust in that gesture was more overwhelming than any sonnet. "It is the most precious thing ever entrusted to me," she confessed, her voice a thread of sound. "Read it," he whispered, his face so close in the dimness that she could see the sparks of anxiety in his grey eyes. "But not now. Read it only when we are truly far from one another, when this room, this moment, is only a memory, so that then you may know that my thoughts have not strayed, that they found you even in the distance." She closed her hand over the folded paper, feeling its sharp edges against her gloved palm. It was a secret, his secret, which was now hers. A shy smile, a true smile, that seemed to emerge from the depths of his nervousness, touched Samuel's lips. "I hope the bard will not be offended that I have hidden my humble prose among his masterpieces." It was a grace, small, clumsy, the first he had directed to her in this intimate and slightly mischievous tone. The effect was instantaneous. A charming blush rose from Eleanor's neck to her cheeks, and she lowered her face, unable to contain a corresponding smile that threatened to break all her composure. Her heart accelerated in a new and glorious way, a rhythm that seemed to whisper the secret she now carried in her hand. "I do not have something rare and precious to give you," she began, her voice a bit firmer now, but still enveloped in the sweetness of the moment. "But I would like you to take this." From the folds of her dress, she pulled out not just any handkerchief, but the one she always carried with her. It was of the finest linen, embroidered at the corners with delicate sprigs of ivy, the stitches so small and regular they seemed made by fairies. "It is my favorite. I embroidered it throughout all of last winter. Each stitch was a way of passing the time." She held it out to him, and the gesture was one of overwhelming intimacy. It was not a gift, it was a loan of herself. Samuel accepted the fabric as if receiving a part of his own soul. He brought it gently to his face, and there it was, stronger than ever, the scent that was exclusively hers. Fresh lavender, the light trace of ink from the books she handled, and something indescribable, fresh and sweet that was simply Eleanor. A tremor ran through his hands, not of nervousness, but of deep reverence. "It is the most beautiful part of my day, now entrusted to me," he said, his voice grave and laden with a feeling that made his 16 years seem a thing of the past. He folded the handkerchief with almost ritualistic precision and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, his hand pressing it for an instant over his heart. "I will guard it with my life until I return, and then you will tell me what you thought of my disobedient verses, hidden among the words of a genius." "I promise," she whispered, and the word sounded like a vow, and it sounded like a warm kiss to his ears. From the drawing room, the sound of the first chords of the next movement began to emerge, urgent and inescapable. "I must withdraw at the conclusion of the concert," Samuel said, a hint of bitterness in the sweetness of the moment. "My brother and I depart at dawn." His eyes, of a deep grey that in the shadows seemed even more mysterious, shone with a liquid intensity, capturing the light of the fire and returning it in the form of pure, contained emotion. "Time robs us of this instant." He then took her hand, still gloved. He leaned in, and with a deliberation that transformed the conventional gesture into something singular, pressed his lips lightly against her knuckles through the thin fabric. It was not a goodbye kiss. It was a seal, a temporary pact. And when he stood, his eyes did not pull away from hers in a silence that spoke of constancy, of anticipated longing, of a promise that needed no words. "Until then, Eleanor, until your return, Samuel." 3 days, 72 hours that dragged like a river of tar for Samuel. The visit to Lord Pembroke was a success. He had impressed with his seriousness. His brother Simon had praised his conduct. His father would be satisfied. But every conversation about diplomacy, every formal dinner, was lived through a veil. His mind was on the book he had delivered, on the handkerchief he carried over his heart, on her flushed face under the effect of his clumsy grace. He could hardly wait to return, to see her, to hear in her voice what she had thought of his verses. The Worthington carriage stopped in the main courtyard at the end of the golden afternoon. Samuel stepped down before the footman could reach the door, his eyes immediately scanning the windows, the garden searching for a sign. Simon stepped down behind him, stretching his back with a sigh of satisfaction. "Good to be back home," commented the older brother, handing his hat and gloves to the butler, Charles, who waited solemnly at the entrance. Samuel did not have such patience. He squeezed his own gloves as he spoke, his voice containing a note of ill-contained urgency. "Charles, the Finch family, are they in the garden or in the guest quarters?" The butler, a man whose expression was normally a monument to impassivity, seemed slightly strained. He exchanged a quick and almost imperceptible glance with Simon before answering, which made Samuel's stomach tighten. "The ladies Finch, sir, have departed." The words were spoken with professional softness, but they fell like stones. "Departed?" Samuel's repetition was a hollow reflex. A sudden chill, completely foreign to the residual warmth of the day, seized him, rising from the base of his spine. He fought against the meaning. "For a stroll in the village? Will they return for dinner?" Charles lowered his eyes slightly. "They have departed indeed, sir, 2 days ago. A hired carriage came to collect them at nightfall." The world around Samuel, the stone courtyard, the familiar facade of the beautiful estate, Simon's voice giving another order to a servant, seemed to tilt, to lose solidity. He heard nothing more. He turned and entered the house, his steps echoing on the marble hall faster than etiquette permitted, leaving Simon behind. He did not go to his father's study. He followed the low sound of voices and the clinking of porcelain to the great tea room. He stopped at the threshold, breathless not from physical effort, but from the hurricane of apprehension that now tore the air from him. The scene inside was a study in domestic tranquility. His father by the tall window with the Times, his mother on the damask sofa with her embroidery, Henry immersed in a book in his usual armchair, and Simon, entering right behind him, his face lit by the self-satisfaction of duty fulfilled. The serene normalcy of the picture was a blow. Samuel forced himself to enter, to square his shoulders. "Father, mother," he greeted with a bow of the head. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, containing a tremor he hoped they would attribute to the exhaustion of the road. "Henry." Lady Worthington raised her face first. "Ah, Samuel, Simon, you are back safe and sound," she said, and her smile was the usual one, but it did not fully reach her eyes, which seemed to examine him with a veiled concern. "How was the road?" "I thank you, it was peaceful," he replied, the automatic courtesy. His gaze swept the room, unconsciously seeking a light-colored dress, a familiar silhouette. "And our guests?" The silence that followed was short but deep. Lady Worthington lowered her eyes to her embroidery. Henry closed his book softly, raising his gaze to his brother with an expression Samuel could not decipher, something between pity and warning. Simon watched with an attentive eye. It was Lord Worthington who spoke after clearing his throat and folding the newspaper with a sharp gesture. "The ladies Finch are no longer with us, Samuel. They have departed." The phrase, so simple, was spoken with the same cadence one would use to announce the passing of a storm. But for Samuel it was the world collapsing in slow motion. "Departed? To the city? Have they returned to their home then?" He forced his voice to maintain a note of practical hope. Should we address our invitations for the next country gathering to their London address, or—" "They did not return to London," interrupted his mother, her voice softer but equally final. "They received an urgent missive, a private patter, you understand. They had to leave in haste 2 days ago. A carriage came for them already under the twilight." "In haste? Without a goodbye?" The question escaped him, laden with an incredulity that bordered on accusation. Lady Worthington appeared distressed. "There was no time for formalities, dear. It was all very abrupt. Mrs. Finch was visibly disturbed." Samuel felt a vacuum open in his chest. He clung to the last lifeline. "But where to? Where should we write? When will they return?" This time the look his parents exchanged was long and eloquent. It was a look that spoke of things unsaid, of reputations, of adult secrets that the young should not peer into. Lord Worthington cleared his throat. Mrs. Finch left no forwarding address, nor could she give assurances of a return. He paused, and the following words fell into the silence of the room like stones into a frozen lake. "It is better, Samuel, not to harbor expectations. It may be that our friends do not return. It may be that never again, never again." The words did not fall like blows. They were the fall itself. The polished wood floor beneath his feet seemed to give way, transforming into an abyss of quicksand. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face, a sudden vertigo that made the room spin slightly. The air failed in his lungs, as if he had taken a punch to the stomach. Over his father's shoulder, he saw Henry. His middle brother was no longer hiding it. His taciturn face was furrowed in an expression of silent grief, his eyes fixed on Samuel with a complete and painful understanding. Across the room, Simon, oblivious to the silent storm, began to speak, his voice full of satisfaction. "Speaking of returns, the visit to Lord Pembroke was exceptionally profitable. The Count was very impressed with Samuel's observations on the Baltic ports, I must say. It was an excellent prelude to Oxford. In the next—" Simon's voice turned into a distant hum, an irrelevant background noise. Samuel no longer heard. He merely nodded, a mechanical movement of the head that meant nothing, and took a step back. "I understand. Excuse me," he managed to articulate, his voice hoarse and strange. And without waiting for an answer, he turned and left the room, leaving behind the familiar scene, the talk of bright futures, and the devastating echo of that single word that now inhabited every corner of his being: never. The solid wood. Floor beneath his feet seemed to turn into quicksand. He felt his face empty of color, the air failing in his lungs. The corridor was too long, the house too big, too empty. His hand went instinctively to his neck, to the tight knot of the cravat that was suffocating him. His fingers, cold and clumsy, struggled with the elegant tie until it came undone, pulling the fabric away from his throat with an almost violent gesture. He needed air. He walked aimlessly, his steps quickening, leading him through the familiar corridors to the doors that opened to the gardens. He crossed the lawn, ignoring the distant call of a servant. His destination was unconscious, but his body knew the way. The pond, the place where he had admired her so many times, especially on dew memorable afternoon, barefoot and serene. Upon reaching the bank, breathless not from effort, but from the unbearable pressure in his chest, He stopped. The pond was quiet, the swans absent. Everything was exactly the same and yet irremediably altered. Her absence was a tangible presence, a vacuum that ached. He had never known when he had begun to wait for her. Perhaps in that first summer, when their eyes met for the first time. Perhaps in the first conversation about books and translations in the library. Perhaps in the woods under the rain. Perhaps the moment her fingers plucked the moss from his sleeve. But there, on the edge of that silent pond, under the cold light of the declining afternoon, he realized with devastating clarity that he had never stopped. And now, without a goodbye, without an explanation, without a future in sight, the waiting transformed into something new, a mute and constant pain, the first and deepest lesson in emotional helplessness of his life. His fingers touched the inner pocket of his coat, where the linen handkerchief, still impregnated with her soft perfume, rested over his heart. The book she had taken, his verses, she read them now, far from there. The thought was a bittersweet and torturous consolation. He had her and he had lost her, all at the same time. And the only thing left to him was the waiting which now, devoid of promise, threatened to consume him from within. Time, which for some is a river, became for Samuel Worthington an ocean to be navigated with precise nautical charts. Oxford received him not as an ordinary student, but as a sharp mind whom tutors pointed out as a rare case of early discernment. He absorbed languages, international laws, and the intricate dance of European politics, not with the fervor of an ambitious youth, but with the silent concentration of a man who directs all the energy of his intellect toward a single purpose, not to think about the void he carried on the left side of his chest, over his heart. At 21, a junior post at the Foreign Office was his, not through direct family connection, but by merit. His reports were clear, his analyses piercing. In meetings, his presence was quiet, but when he spoke, veteran diplomats inclined their heads to listen. He was seen as a serious young man, promising, perhaps a bit cold. The third son of the Viscount of Alderley was building a notable reputation, while his eldest brother Simon established himself as heir, and Henry, the middle son, managed the estates with quiet efficiency. In London drawing rooms, beneath shimmering chandeliers, Samuel was a distinguished figure. Tall, with broad shoulders that filled his coat with natural elegance, his face had lost the softness of early youth, gaining firm angles and a brow that seemed permanently, slightly furrowed in concentration. His eyes, the grey of a distant storm, swept through rooms with an observation that was disarming. Dazzling ladies, daughters of dukes, earls and magnates were introduced to him. They were kind, polite, some even witty. Their mothers cast calculating glances toward the young diplomat without a title, but with a future. None, however, could hold his gaze for more than a moment, required by courtesy. No laughter rang with the right timbre. No opinion, however intelligent, carried that spark of unique understanding that made the world rearrange itself. He was polished always, but impenetrable. Conversation never moved past the superficial, and his interest clearly never ignited. It is the younger Worthington, an elegant iceberg, some whispered. Focused on his career. There is no room for romance in his agenda, others speculated. They did not know that the agenda of his heart had been filled for years, with a single name written in indelible letters and a blank space beside it where the location should be. On the other side of this ocean of silence, in a series of rented rooms in cities of varying names and equally fleeting faces, Eleanor, now known as Miss Ellen Fairchild, had also grown. The girl with wise eyes had become a young woman of a contained and melancholy beauty. Her hair, still the colour of night, was styled simply, and her dresses, though clean and well cut, were of discreet colours, made not to draw attention. Life was a succession of sudden departures. A comfortable apartment in Bath, left with a bag packed in an hour. A cosy cottage in the Lake District, abandoned before the lilies in the garden had fully bloomed. Miss Bell, now greyer but with eyes still vigilant, was her only. Constant besides her mother, whose face had aged prematurely, marked by perpetual anxiety. Questions were not asked. One simply obeyed. "It is for our safety, dear," was the only explanation, always whispered, always vague. In each new place, the first item to be unpacked was a small worn book, bound in leather, the sonnets. It rested on her nightstand like a secular altar, and each night, before blowing out the candle, she opened it to the page marked by the silk ribbon, now faded. There, folded and almost fragile from so much handling, was the paper. She no longer needed to unfold it to read. She knew every word, every curve of the firm and elegant handwriting by heart, but she unfolded it nonetheless. It was a ritual. Her fingers traced the lines, hearing in her mind the echo of the voice that had whispered those words in the dim light of a library that seemed to belong to another life. They spoke of shared silences, of the light in a gaze, of a constancy that needed no name. It was her secret nourishment, the proof that that connection had not been a youthful dream. It was real as the pain of his absence. "Where are you now?" she whispered to the dark. The paper pressed against her chest. His grey eyes, so serious and deep, how would they be? Would they have hardened with the world? Would he remember? Doubt was a constant shadow, but the poem and the memory of the handkerchief she had embroidered and he had promised to keep were her beacons against it. Back in London, one night at the Gentlemen's Club, Henry found his younger brother leaning against the fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression he knew well. Henry was now a grown man, engaged to a sensible young woman for whom he harbored a calm and real affection. Life seemed finally understandable to him. "Thinking of treaties or customs tariffs?" Henry asked, stopping beside him, his dry humor still present but tempered by a recent maturity. Samuel did not even turn. Thinking of the ineffectiveness of both to resolve certain impasses, Henry took a sip of his brandy. "Ah, does the impasse in question have dark hair and eyes that, according to your unique description 5 years ago, change color with the weather?" Samuel remained silent. It was answer enough. "Samuel," Henry began, his tone losing its lightness, "years have passed. She disappeared. She left no trace, not even her mother, a woman with some knowledge of the world, wrote to our mother. It is not disloyalty to move on. Even father and mother, who were fond of them, no longer mention her. They expect you to settle down." "I am settled," Samuel replied, his voice low but firm, finally looking at his brother. In the glow of the fire, his profile looked carved in granite. "In the Foreign Office. On my terms. I mean having a life, a home, a wife." Henry shook his head. "We do not know her whereabouts. We do not know if she is married, or even if she is—" He did not have the courage to complete the sentence. "You speak of her when you rarely speak at all, as one who refuses to lose her. But my dear brother, sometimes losing is not a choice. It is a fact." Samuel turned fully then, and in his grey eyes Henry saw not the passion of a youth, but the deep and unshakable conviction of a man. "No," Samuel corrected, each word distinct and heavy as a stone. "You misunderstand. I do not speak as one who refuses to lose her." He paused, and the noisy world of the club seemed to vanish around them. "I speak as one who has never lost her. I feel her, alive, inside me." The declaration hung in the air, as solid and implacable as the truth it carried. Henry had no answer. He saw in that moment that his brother's waiting was not fueled by a youthful and fragile hope. It was a certainty, a cornerstone of his existence. To lose hope would be like losing a limb. He had learned to live with the absence, but the absence itself was an integral part of who he was. Henry merely nodded, a gesture of resignation and of a sudden and deep respect. He touched his brother's shoulder briefly and walked away, leaving Samuel with his flames and his silent constancy. In his room later, Samuel did not take an embroidered handkerchief from his pocket. He did not need to. The memory of its scent, of the weight of the fine fabric in his hand, of the promise made, was engraved in his memory, more deeply than any object. He looked out the window at misty London. Somewhere under a different sky, she too would be breathing, and as long as both breathed, the thread woven in those distant summers, though invisible and stretched to the point of nearly breaking, was not broken. The flame, far from going out, had learned to burn slowly, feeding not on contact, but on the pure, stubborn and inexplicable certainty that what they had recognized in each other at 10 and 12 years old was too rare to have been an accident. It was a truth. And some truths, Samuel had decided, were worth waiting a lifetime for. The London spring arrived with an air of renewal, but for Samuel Worthington, The cycle remained the same. Drawing rooms, music, hollow conversations. At 23, he was now a man whose professional reputation outshone his social reluctance. The rumors of the elegant iceberg persisted, and the pressure for an advantageous marriage was a constant whisper yet distant, like the noise of traffic outside a window. It was at a ball in the modest but respectable Barrington mansion that the world, without prior warning, shifted off its axis. The ballroom was crowded, warm with the heat of bodies and the glow of hundreds of candles. Samuel stood near the entrance, listening with half attention to an acquaintance discourse on Greek politics, when something, a line of a profile, the curve of a tilted neck, caught his peripheral vision and arrested his breath. On the other side of the room, near a large window open to alleviate the heat, a small group of ladies conversed, and among them, in profile to him, was a vision that made his blood stop running. She wore an elegant dress in light tones, without the excessive lace of the others, her dark brown hair swept up in an elegant style that revealed the nape of her neck. She was smiling softly at something an older lady was saying, and Gu's smile, shy, contained, genuine, was an arrow straight to a heart he had thought dormant. The world around him lost sound, color, and movement. Everything narrowed down to that silhouette bathed in the golden candlelight. It was as if a bubble of absolute silence formed around him, and within it there was only that face, that smile, and a whirlwind of visceral, overwhelming recognition. He moved without thinking, his body navigating through the ballroom like a ghost ship, passing by laughter and conversations he did not register. The lady talking with the young woman, Mrs. Allerton, saw him approach, and her face lit up with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Worthington, how good to see you. Allow me to introduce a charming new addition to our circle," said Mrs. Allerton, lightly touching the young woman's arm. She turned, and her eyes, God, her eyes, the same pure shade of a crystalline spring, met his. Time truly froze. Eleanor, for it could be no other, froze. All the blood seemed to drain from her face, only to return in an overwhelming wave of a blush, painting her pale cheeks and the base of her delicate neck. Her lips, momentarily parted, closed. Her gloved fingers tightened on the fan she carried until her knuckles went stiff. But her eyes could not pull away from his. They were wells of shock, of fear, of an emotion so raw it made Samuel's chest ache. "This is Miss Ellen Fairchild," continued Mrs. Allerton, oblivious to the earthquake she had just unleashed. "She has just arrived from a long season in Italy. Miss Fairchild, Mr. Samuel Worthington, one of our most distinguished young men from the Foreign Office." Samuel forced himself to function. He bowed, the automatic movement of an educated gentleman, but his eyes never left her. "Miss Fairchild," he said, and his voice sounded hoarse, strange in his own ears. "It is an unexpected pleasure." She made a small curtsy, the movement perfect, yet rigid. "Mr. Worthington," she whispered, and that timbre, deeper than in memory but with the same musical clarity, was another direct blow to his soul. The first chords of a waltz began to play. Samuel saw panic flicker through her eyes. A deep, possessive and protective instinct awakened within him. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice regaining a thread of firmness, "would you honor me with this dance?" Mrs. Allerton seemed delighted. Ellen, seemed as if she might faint. He saw the conflict in her face, the hysteria of flight against years of training in composure won by a thread. "It would be an honor," she murmured, placing her trembling hand in his. Upon touching her, even through the gloves, an electric current raced up his arm. He led her to the dance floor, his world reduced to the space between their bodies. She was a vision. The slender girl had given way to a woman of soft and elegant curves, a natural grace in her movements that the other trained ladies lacked. Her face, now of a classical and melancholy beauty, was the realization of all his hazy memories. "You dance exceptionally well for someone who has just arrived," he commented, his tone soft, but his eyes scanning every detail of her like a starving man. "The dance is an ancient language older than words," she replied, her voice contained, her eyes fixed on a point over his shoulder. "From where exactly in Italy, Miss Fairchild?" "Florence? Rome?" He tried to keep the conversation mundane, but every word was bait. "Oh, From several places. We travelled frequently. Curious. I have never heard your name before. A beauty and refinement such as yours would hardly go unnoticed. She faltered in a step, and he held her firmly, pulling her an inch closer. Her perfume was different, something more floral, perhaps Italian. But beneath it, he swore he caught a trace of that familiar lavender. The proximity was a sweet torture. She was here, alive, and more beautiful than ever, in his arms. "My mother and I prefer a private life," she said, her voice almost a whisper. The music spun them. He led her in a turn, and as she spun, the chandelier above caught the smooth skin of her long neck, revealed by her hairstyle, and there, just below the hairline near the right ear, was a small spot, an almost imperceptible mole, the same mark his eyes in his early youth had memorized in a wood years ago. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs with a force he feared she might hear. All the air left his lungs. The doubt, the agonizing hope, evaporated, replaced by a certainty of steel. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear, his breath a warmth on her neck. The voice that came from him was not that of a diplomat, but of a man whose world had just reset onto its axis after years of darkness. "Where have you been for so long, Eleanor?" She stopped. She stopped dancing in the middle of the floor, the bodies, around them contouring them with awkwardness. All the blood vanished from her face again, leaving her pale as marble. Her eyes, huge and terrified, met his. The mask of Miss Fairchild cracked, revealing the frightened girl, the young woman who had fled. She had never been presented in London society, having left before then. But still, fate wished to play with her, and on that night it placed her face to face with the only person who had known her always. Without a word, she pulled, her hand away from his. The waltz was ending. She made a hurried and almost stumbling curtsy and disappeared into the crowd, heading not toward the other ladies, but toward the doors leading to the gardens. Samuel did not think. He followed her. He found her near a gazebo lit by lanterns, breathless, a hand pressed against her chest as if trying to contain her heart. A few groups strolled through the garden, giving them an illusory privacy. "Wait," his voice came low, but laden with an authority that made her tremble. He reached her, holding her gently but firmly by the arm. "Please, do not run from me, not again." She tried to pull away, but her movement was weak. "Please, Mr. Worthington, you are mistaken." "I am not," he cut in, his face close to hers, his grey eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen. "Do you think I would forget? A single day, a single detail. I have tortured myself for years, Eleanor, without a clue, without a goodbye, without a damn letter to tell me if you were alive or dead." The emotion contained for so long cracked his voice. I never forgot you. I waited." The final words, the famous whisper, were not a romantic declaration. They were an accusation, a statement of a fact as hard and real as stone. I waited, and the life he had built around that waiting was right there, in that gaze, in that trembling voice. Tears, which she had fought to contain, began to roll down her face, silent and devastating. "You do not understand. I must go. Please, do not tell anyone you saw me. Forget that name." "Forget?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "It is the only thing I have never been able to do." He prevented her from moving away again, his hand still on her arm, the warmth of the touch aflame between them. "At least, tell me where I can find you. An address, a place." She shook her head, the tears shining like diamonds under the lantern light. "You cannot, you should not. It is dangerous." "For whom?" he implored, his brow almost touching hers. Her scent now, mixed with the night, was intoxicating. "Dangerous for you? Let me protect you. This time, let me stay." At that moment, a discreet shadow approached. It was Miss Bell, older, her eyes full of alarm and a deep sadness. "Ellen, dear, the carriage is ready." Ellen looked at the chaperone, then back at Samuel, her face a battlefield of fear and a desire so deep it mirrored his own. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice broken. He did not physically stop her. He watched her turn and follow Miss Bell, her cream dress vanishing into the darkness beyond the circles of garden light. A simple carriage waited in the side lane. He saw her climb in, saw her look back one last time, her pale and tear-stained face at the window, before the vehicle departed, swallowed by the London night. Samuel stood still, his whole body trembling, his heart a wild drum in his chest. Her scent was still on his coat, in the air around him. Eleanor alive, here, and fleeing again. The diplomat's coldness fell away. A new purpose, fierce and absolute, took its place. He turned and marched back into the ballroom, his eyes searching for Mrs. Allerton. He found her, smiling near the buffet. "Mrs. Allerton," he said, his voice now clear, controlled, but with an urgency of steel beneath. "The young lady who just departed. Miss Fairchild. Where can I find her? It is most urgent." Mrs. Allerton appeared surprised, then understanding, misinterpreting the intensity in his eyes. "Our young love. She and her mother now reside at the Fairchild home in Mayfair, number 12, Berkeley Street. Sir Reginald Fairchild is her stepfather, a very respected gentleman, but I believe they depart for the country soon, for Scotland, I believe. Mrs. Fairchild wishes to settle some family matters there." Samuel did not hear the rest. Number 12, Berkeley Street. The address burned in his mind like a beacon. The waiting finally had a destination. The Fairchild carriage stopped before the elegant and discreet residence on Berkeley Street. Eleanor, Ellen, climbed the steps like a ghost, her steps mechanical, guided by the firm hand of Miss Bell. The cream dress, which had previously seemed an armor of composure, now weighed on her like a burden. As soon as the door to her room, no longer a rented room, but her own chamber in a secure house, closed, all the strength that had kept her upright vanished. She leaned against the wood, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in short, uncontrolled gasps. The image of him, so close, his grey eyes burning with that mixture of incredulity, accusation, and a raw desire that had left her in flames, repeated in her mind in an overwhelming loop. Miss Bell lit a candle, the flickering flame illuminating the chaperone's lined face. She said nothing, merely observing Eleanor with a look that saw through decades of disguises and flights. She knew every nuance of that young woman, from the curious girl to the frightened woman who stood at the edge of an emotional precipice. He recognized me," Eleanor finally whispered, the words coming out like a pained sigh. "Even after all these years, even with the false name, the hairstyle differently. He knew." "Some impressions do not fade with time, my flower," replied Miss Bell, her voice surprisingly soft, "especially when they are impressions of the soul, not just of the face." Eleanor moved away from the door, her hands trembling as she tried to undo the hooks of her dress. Miss Bell went to help her, her agile and calm fingers contrasting with the young woman's tremor. "How can fate be so cruel, Agatha?" Eleanor said, using the chaperone's first name in a rare moment of intimate despair. "Of all the rooms in London, of all the people, he was there, and he has grown." Her voice broke on the last word, laden with an admiration so deep it was almost an ache. Miss Bell helped her take off the dress and wrapped her in a wool robe. "Yes, he has grown. He has become a man, I must say, of remarkable presence." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the candle flame. A hot blush rose to her cheeks, not of shame, but from the whirlwind of sensations assaulting her. "Have you ever seen a more handsome man?" The question came in a whisper, almost to herself, laden with a youthful vulnerability that the years had not erased. Miss Bell sat beside her, taking a brush to gently untangle her hair. "Beauty is common, Ellen. The intensity he carried in his gaze upon seeing you, that is rare. He seemed disturbed, in the deepest sense of the word, torn from his foundations. He said he waited," Eleanor confessed, the tears returning, silent and warm. "That he tortured himself all these years. How is it possible? We were only 2 children. A special friendship, yes, but someone like him, with his future, his name, his brilliance, he could not be mine, never. He should know that. His path was already laid out, like the tracks of a train, straight, shining, leading to places where I have no passage." As she spoke, her hand went instinctively to the book on the nightstand. She pulled it to her lap, opening it to the familiar page. The folded paper, yellowed and fragile, fell into her lap. Miss Bell stopped brushing and looked at the paper, then at the young woman's anguished face. Her eyes, usually so pragmatic, softened with deep compassion. "Dear Ellen," she began, her voice a thread of serene wisdom in the silent room, "the heart is the most rebellious geographer that exists. It completely ignores the limits that others draw on maps." She pointed delicately to the poem. "And a man who writes words like these, who entrusts them to a book margin like the most precious secret, that is not a man devoid of love. He is a man who recognizes it and guards it. Eleanor held the paper against her chest, as if she could absorb the comfort of the words written by him an eternity ago. Miss Bell set the brush aside and spoke, her voice low, but with the solidity of an ancestral truth. "Do not be deceived by the noise of the world. Men who wait in silence," she said, pausing significantly, her eyes fixed on Eleanor's, full of understanding, "tend to love deeper than those who shout." The phrase echoed in the room, more powerful than any extravagant declaration. It did not promise a happy ending. It did not deny the dangers, the obstacles, the separate tracks. But it honored the quality of the feeling. It dignified the weight. It gave a name to the quiet force that had kept a flame alive through years of darkness and flight. Eleanor swallowed hard, her tears subsiding. She looked at the paper, at the words that spoke of silences and constancy. She looked at the door, through which she had fled from him once again. And for the first time since their eyes had met in the ballroom, fear was not the only thing in her chest. There was a thread of something warm, stubborn, and forbidden, the terrible, wonderful hope that perhaps some tracks could against all odds meet. The following morning dawned with a pale and determined light, reflecting Samuel Worthington's state of mind. He had not slept. He had spent the night between mental maps of possibilities and the vivid memory of her gloved fingers in his, of her scent beneath the London night, of the gaze that had pierced through years of solitude. There was no more room for doubt or for diplomatic patience. His heart, so long entrenched in silence, demanded movement. At 9 o'clock he stood before number 12 Berkeley Street. The house was solid, elegant without ostentation, with high windows and an air of acquired tranquility. Only a year before, he would have considered it just another Mayfair residence. Now it was the epicenter of his world. He was received by a sober-faced butler, and within minutes he found himself in the sitting-room, where Sir Reginald Fairchild rose to greet him. The man was taller than Samuel had imagined, with grey hair precisely cut, and eyes that were not harsh but deeply observant. "Mr. Worthington," said Sir Reginald, with a firm handshake, "it is an honour to receive you. My wife has spoken much to me of your family." "Sir Reginald," Samuel returned the courtesy, maintaining impeccable posture but feeling every muscle tense beneath his coat. "The pleasure is mine." It was then that Mrs. Finch, now Fairchild, entered the room. Time had transformed her. Yes, her face, once marked by a youthful serenity, now bore fine lines of worry and a silent strength in her eyes. But when her blue-grey eyes landed on Samuel, a flash of something warm and recognizable emerged. "Mr. Worthington," she said, her voice a bit hoarse but clear. "What a surprise, and what a man you have become." He bowed his head, a wave of unexpected emotion tightening his throat. "Mrs. Fairchild, it is a pleasure to see you again after so many years. I am sincerely happy that you are back and well." She smiled, a small but true gesture. "I thank you for your kind words. And you, I hear of a man of great influence and worth at the Foreign Office. Your parents must be very proud." He matched the smile, a shy and contained version of the gratitude he felt that she was still alive, still breathing, still here. "They are patient with my choices." A brief silence hung, heavy with the unspoken past. Samuel took a deep breath. "And, Miss Finch? Forgive me, Fairchild. Is she well?" Sir Reginald and his wife exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible look. It was enough for a chill to run down Samuel's spine. "Ellen has gone for a walk in Hyde Park," Sir Reginald said, his tone deliberately neutral, "with young Mr. Fairchild. The two get along very well. They appreciate each other's company. The young lady seemed to be in need of fresh morning air." "I beg your pardon. Who?" "Edmund Fairchild, my son." "Son?" The information fell like a stone into still waters, sending ripples of a silent, primitive jealousy that Samuel hardly recognized in himself. He struggled to maintain a serene expression. "Your son? I did not know you had a son." "The fruit of my first marriage," Sir Reginald explained, observing Samuel with renewed interest. "A good lad, very attached to Ellen." Samuel nodded, the gesture mechanical. Inside, his mind worked rapidly. Attached, walks in the park, company. Each word was a small burden. It was Mrs. Fairchild who broke the ensuing silence, her gaze fixed on Samuel, grave and pleading. "Samuel, in the name of years of friendship and old acquaintance, there is a request I must make. Anything. When you refer to my daughter, please, call her Ellen." "Fairchild." Her voice was soft but laden with an underlying tension that made Samuel furrow his brow slightly. "Why?" Her discomfort became noticeable. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words seemed to stick. It was Sir Reginald who intervened, placing a comforting hand on his wife's arm. "My dear," he said, turning to Samuel, "I believe Mr. Worthington is not here out of mere formality, nor is he any longer the boy you and Lord Worthington tried to protect." His eyes, intelligent and weighed, studied Samuel. "He is a grown man, respectable, and a diplomat of rare discernment. Perhaps it is time to leave the shadow of the secret, for the good of all." Mrs. Fairchild seemed to struggle with herself, her face pale. "His parents asked that he never be involved." "And his parents," Sir Reginald replied calmly, "now see a man who deals with secrets of state. A man who, judging by the determination in his eyes, will not leave here without answers." He turned back to Samuel. "What do you think, Mr. Worthington? Are you capable of keeping a dangerous secret without endangering those it protects?" Samuel felt the weight of the question. It was not idle curiosity. It was a test. "Sir," he said, his voice low and grave, "my life at the Foreign Office is built upon the guarding of secrets. But more than that, my loyalty has always been toward those who deserve the truth, and toward those I hold in the highest regard in silence." The last phrase hung in the air. Mrs. Fairchild closed her eyes for a second as if accepting the inevitable. "Very well," she whispered. "Reginald, perhaps it is only fair." Sir Reginald gestured to Samuel. "Let us go to my study." The two men left the room, and Samuel felt his heart accelerate with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Finally, the pieces would begin to fit together. The study was lined with dark wood, with bookshelves, and the comforting scent of paper and tobacco. "Sir." Reginald offered him a chair and sat behind the desk, his fingers interlaced. "Everything I am about to tell you," he began, "must remain within these walls, until we have secure means to act." Samuel nodded. Eleanor's father, Lorenzo Finch, was a brilliant and idealistic man, an Italian nobleman deeply involved in the Risorgimento. During a secret diplomatic mission, he discovered that a British peer, Lord Mortimer Blackwood, was trafficking classified information to both Austria and factions opposed to Italian unification, compromising documents which, if exposed, would destroy Blackwood and tarnish the name of Great Britain. Samuel listened, each word confirming suspicions that had wandered the periphery of his mind for years. Lorenzo was convinced to keep silent, and when he refused, his death was arranged to look like an accident. Sir Reginald paused, his face somber. Maria, Mrs. Fairchild, inherited not only the grief, but the documents, and, with them, the persecution. Blackwood feared she would use them, or that Eleanor would become a symbol of his treason. They were forced to flee, to hide, to change names, cities, countries. "And my parents, how do they enter this story?" Samuel asked, his voice contained. "They were friends of Lorenzo Finch. The invitations to spend seasons in the country at their estate were a way to help keep them safe. It was a temporary refuge for a few years, until a friend of Maria's, Lady Fitzroy, whose husband had contacts in intelligence, sent an urgent letter. Their location had been discovered. They had hours to escape without compromising anyone's safety." Sir Reginald looked directly at Samuel. "Your father, Lord Worthington, was informed. It was he who provided the carriage, the escape route, the initial resources for them to reach Italy safely. It was an act of courage and loyalty, and just in time. For the next day, men were seen around the estate inquiring about their presence." Samuel felt the floor give way beneath his feet, not from surprise but from a painful confirmation. "He never told me, because you were very young. A boy who, as your mother told you at the time, had an open heart and a future that could not be compromised by a deadly secret. If you tried to make contact, if you wrote letters, if you asked questions, it could draw attention, put them, and yourself, at risk." Sir Reginald leaned forward. "They separated you to protect you all. It was the hardest choice your parents ever made, and Maria carries the guilt for it every day." Samuel swallowed hard. The anger he had nurtured for years, for the departure without explanation, for the silence, began to transform into something more complex, a deep sadness and an agonizing respect. "And now?" he asked. "Why did you return?" "Maria's inheritance from her family in Scotland needs to be claimed, and the documents that protect her late husband's legacy still exist. But now, with my influence and the gradual decline of Blackwood's power, we saw a window, a chance to clear Lorenzo's name, to give Eleanor a future without fear." Sir Reginald sighed. "But the danger has not vanished. Hence the name Fairchild. Hence the discretion." Samuel stood up, walking to the window. The verdant park of London stretched out in the distance. Somewhere in that landscape, Eleanor was walking with another man. "I will help you," he said without turning. "I have contacts, resources. I can move in the circles where Blackwood still breathes." Sir Reginald rose as well. "She is no longer the girl you knew, Samuel. She has lived a life of caution. Her trust is not given easily." "I know," Samuel replied, finally looking at him. "In truth it never was, but neither is mine." When Samuel left the study, promising to return with a plan, his step was determined, but his heart was restless. The truth had given him clarity, but also a new kind of torment. Eleanor was not just hidden from the world. She was integrated into a new family, with a new borrowed brother accompanying her to the park. He was about to leave through the front door when he heard it, a clear, musical laugh that cut through the air of the entrance hall like a ray of sunlight. Ellen entered, her cheeks flushed from the fresh air, still smiling at something Edmund at her side had said. Edmund Fairchild was tall, broad-shouldered, with a pleasant face and brown eyes that fixed on Samuel with immediate curiosity, and shortly after a cautious reserve. But Samuel hardly saw him. His eyes were locked on her. She stopped, the smile freezing on her lips. The world around them seemed to fade away again. "Mr. Worthington," she said, her whisper almost inaudible. "Miss Fairchild," he replied, the formality sounding strange and painful in his own mouth. Edmund took a step forward, positioning himself slightly between them. "Do we have a visitor, Ellen?" "An old family friend, Edmund," she said quickly, but her eyes did not pull away from Samuel's. "Mr. Worthington, this is Edmund Fairchild." Samuel bowed his head, feeling the tension emanating from the other man. "Mr. Fairchild." "Worthington," Edmund replied, his tone neutral, but his eyes were not friendly. They were vigilant. "Miss Fairchild," Samuel said, ignoring Edmund, "I would like a word, if it is permitted." Eleanor looked at Edmund, then back at Samuel. There was a conflict there, but something in her eyes, a spark of recognition, of ancient desire, gave way. "Of course. Edmund, please give us a moment." Edmund hesitated, his eyes scanning Samuel's face with suspicion. "I will be right there," he said, gesturing toward the library door with his head. "Do not go far." When he moved away, a spark of silent conflict crossed the space between the two men. Samuel felt it, the territorial instinct, the distrust, and something inside him, something primitive and possessive, responded in kind. As soon as they were alone in the entrance, Samuel's mask cracked. "Why are you here? How did you find us?" Eleanor asked, her voice low and trembling. He smiled, a small, crooked gesture. "I am a diplomat, Eleanor. It is not difficult to locate someone when one knows they are in the city." She lowered her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Why are you here?" she repeated, as if the answer were vital. "For you," he said, simply. She looked up, and the magnetism between them was intense, an electric current running through the air, laden with years of silence and longing. He looked to the side, where Edmund observed them from afar, arms crossed. "Tell me, are you spoken for?" Samuel asked, his voice lower, laden with a meaning that could not be misinterpreted. She furrowed her brow, confused for a second, until understanding cleared her eyes. She followed his gaze, and a light blush rose up her neck. "Edmund? No, he is a good friend. I do not like the way he hovers around you. He is protective," she explained, but her voice was soft, almost defensive. "Because of everything, of the years spent running. He is kind. He wants to give me family security. It was many years living with only me, Mother, and Miss Bell without a male presence. Now Mother has married, and I have gained a family. He merely watches over me, like an older brother." "Older brother, is it?" Samuel repeated, his gaze piercing. "I am not quite sure that is what he thinks of you." Eleanor crossed her arms, a defensive posture, but her eyes were vulnerable. "What do you want, Samuel?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Her scent, lavender and something new, something floral, enveloped him. "Please," he whispered, his voice laden with a plea he had never used with anyone. "Do not be harsh with me. Do not run. I was only trying to understand why we were torn from one another. And now I know." Her eyes widened. "You know?" "Everything," he confirmed, his voice grave and close. "About your father, about Blackwood, about the flight, about my own father helping you." He reached out, gently touching her arm. The contact, even through the sleeves, was like a shock. "I will do everything in my power to help you, to help both of you, but I would like the opportunity to see you, truly, with time to show you how much I have missed you in these last years." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. They were caught in a silent, intense dialogue that drew them closer than any word. They were adults now. The attraction between them was no longer the innocent curiosity of childhood, nor the lovely confusion of early youth. It was something deep, more mature, conscious, a desire that knew its own name and its own risks. "Eleanor," he whispered, his thumb gently caressing the sleeve of her dress. "The owner of my most beautiful dreams. Do not push me away, please." A tear finally escaped, rolling down her cheek. Samuel did not hesitate. With a smooth movement, he took from the inner pocket of his coat a handkerchief of the finest linen, embroidered with delicate sprigs of ivy at the corners. It was the same one she had given him years ago. He held it up and dried the tear with a reverence that was almost a kiss. She looked at the handkerchief, then at him, her eyes wide with wonder. "Should you still have it?" He smiled, a calm, deep, serene smile. "How could I lose something of yours," he said, each word laden with meaning, "that I vowed to guard with my life?" He folded the handkerchief again, now stained with her tear, and tucked it back over his heart. "I will protect you, Eleanor. Even if to everyone else you are Ellen, to me you will always be my enchanting Eleanor. I will help you bring truth and justice. Just, please, do not run from me." She did not answer. With words. She only nodded, the tears flowing freely now, but a smile, small, trembling but real, touched her lips. He breathed a sigh of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had carried for years. "I will send a message through Miss Bell, so that we may meet soon, somewhere far from the watchful eyes of the new guard dog." She let out a muffled laugh mixed with a sob. "He is not a guard dog. That is not how it— He is boring holes into me with his gaze." Before moving away, he gazed at her once more, his grey eyes burning with an intensity that promised everything: protection, truth, a future. And he smiled, a smile that was only for her. "I spent endless days and nights waiting for you," he whispered, the words of vow in the air between them. "I will not let you move away from me again." And then, with one last nod to Edmund, a gesture of recognition but also of a boundary drawn, Samuel turned and left, leaving Eleanor standing in the entrance, her heart beating in a wild rhythm, ancient and new at the same time, and the sweet, terrifying certainty that the waiting finally had a face, and a heart that beat in the same rhythm as hers. The days that followed the reunion were a silent whirlwind within Eleanor, not of agitation, but of a fundamental reorientation of her world. Every heartbeat now possessed a double meaning: the ancient, familiar rhythm of her own being, and a new echo, deep and resonant, that responded to the man who now walked by her side again. No longer an ethereal memory, but a physical presence, breathing, undeniable. The first truly private meeting was arranged with the silent complicity of Miss Bell in the private tea room of the British Museum. It was a space seldom frequented on Tuesday afternoons, with large windows that poured a golden dusty light over shelves of rare books and displays of minerals. Enough chaperonage for decorum, enough distance for intimacy. Eleanor arrived first, seated in a green velvet armchair, hands interlaced in her lap to contain her trembling. When Samuel entered, the air seemed to withdraw from the room. He was dressed with elegant simplicity, a dark coat, a discreet cravat, but his presence filled the space in a way that made her stomach tighten. His grey eyes found hers. Across the room and the outside world, the sounds of wagons, the whispers of other visitors, faded away. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice a bit hoarse, as he approached and made a small bow. "Mr. Worthington," she replied, standing up, feeling the formality like a thin shell over a volcano of emotion. He sat in the opposite armchair, a small marble table between them. Miss Bell was at a respectable distance, absorbed in a catalogue of fossils, her profile a discreet and vigilant silhouette. The first few minutes were of safe conversation, the weather, the London humidity, the silent beauty of the stones around them. But then Samuel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that undid any preamble. "Did you read it?" he asked, his voice so low it was almost a movement of the lips. Eleanor felt a warmth rise from her chest to her face. Her hands moved instinctively to the small velvet purse at her side. "I did," she whispered, "many times, until the paper began to fray at the folds." He swallowed hard, his eyes darkening. "And," she took a deep breath, daring to hold him in her gaze, "I know them by heart, every word, every pause." She then closed her eyes for a second, as if seeking courage in the dark behind her eyelids. When she opened them, she began to recite, her voice a melodious breath that filled the space between them like incense smoke. "Not in grand halls or sunlit fields I found the map of my awaiting deep and true, but in the quiet space where thought takes flight, and in the storm-grey gaze that is of you. They speak of love in shouts, in bold protest, in gifts that glitter under ballroom lights. Mine grew in silence, a forbidden guest nourished by your intellectual heights. So let them chart their empires, draw their lines, and trade in whispers, politics, and gold. My only kingdom is where your soul shines, a story yet untold, and brave, and old. And though the world may set its rails of stone, my heart has learned a geography of its own." The final words hung in the air, laden with an emotional weight that made Samuel's eyes shimmer with moisture. He seemed unable to speak, his face a mask of raw vulnerability. "You memorized it," he finally said, his voice broken. "How could I not?" she replied, her own tears threatening. "It was these words that kept me warm on the coldest nights in Italy. That reminded me that what we felt was not a youthful fantasy. It was real. You spoke of silence, of secret geographies. It was the language of my own soul." She reached her hand out over the table, not to touch him, but in a gesture of offering. He looked at her gloved hand. Then, with a deliberation that stopped time, he removed his own glove. His hand, strong and long-fingered, lay exposed on the cold marble. Then he turned it, palm up, a silent invitation. Eleanor looked at Miss Bell, who discreetly turned. Another page of the catalogue, her gaze fixed on the paper. It was consent enough. With trembling hands, Eleanor unfastened the small button at her wrist and slid off the silk glove. Her hand, pale and delicate, emerged. She placed it, hesitantly, upon his open palm. The touch was electric. It was not the fleeting touch of passing a book, nor the gloved touch at the ball. It was a direct contact, warm, human, a circuit finally closed after years of distance. He wrapped his fingers around hers gently, as if holding a wounded bird. The texture of her skin, the lines of her palm, the strength contained in his grip, everything was an overwhelming revelation. "Eleanor," he breathed low, his thumb beginning to trace small circles on the back of her hand. An unexpected shiver ran through her, sweet and inevitable. "All this time, you were with me, and you with me," she whispered, her eyes locked on the point where their hands met. "In your verses, in the memory of your handkerchief, in the way you moved the branches from my path." He looked up and their eyes met in a silent dialogue that said everything words dared not. There was longing there, a deep and painful longing. There was admiration for the woman she had become, more serious, more beautiful, with a graceful melancholy that shrouded her intelligence like mist. And there was something more, a deep, patient, fully conscious attraction, a desire that knew the price of waiting and, therefore, its own immeasurable value. Slowly, so slowly, he brought her hand to his lips. First, his lips merely pressed against the knuckle of her fingers, a gentleman's kiss, correct. But then, his eyes closed, and he returned, his warm lips resting against her skin for a moment longer, laden with meaning. Her breath caught. It was a stolen kiss, yes, but one she stole back by tilting her hand slightly, allowing the contact to deepen. When he released her hand, the air between them was charged, heavy with a promise that could finally be named. Both took a deep breath like swimmers surfacing from deep waters. In the meetings that followed, brief walks in Hyde Park with Miss Bell a few paces behind, or visits to the National Gallery, this new intimacy flourished. They spoke of the lost years with a frankness that was in itself a form of touch. He told her of Oxford, of the deliberate coldness he had adopted as armour, of the ballrooms he saw through a veil of boredom. "I compared them all to you," he admitted once as they walked under a grey sky. "No conversation had the same texture, no smile had the same light." She, in turn, spoke of Italy, not of tourist beauty, but of real life lived in shadows. The rented houses with views of dark courtyards, the constant packing of luggage, the fear that savoured every moment of peace. "But I had my book," she said, lightly touching the purse where the sonnets rested. "And it reminded me that somewhere there was a gentleman who saw the world with the same eyes as mine. It made me feel less lost." Every confession drew them closer, not as children reuniting, but as adults discovering one another. The attraction between them was different now. Deeper, more dangerous, more magnetic. He saw the strength behind her sweetness, the courage that had kept her sane through fear. She saw the contained passion behind his diplomatic reserve, the fierce loyalty that would move mountains. One afternoon on a hidden bench in Kensington Gardens, with Miss Bell taking a tactical walk around a rose bed, he took her hand again. This time their fingers interlaced naturally, as if they belonged to each other. "I do not know what the future holds for us," he said, looking at their joined hands. "The obstacles are real. Blackwood still breathes. Society has expectations." She squeezed his hand. "I know. But I can no longer live by half," he continued, looking up at her. His eyes were like steel under the diffused light. "I want you in my life, Eleanor, not hidden, not as a secret, as my partner, my wife." The word wife echoed in the space between them, laden with a glorious and terrifying weight. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she brought his hand to her face, leaning her cheek against his knuckles. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth, the texture, the reality of him. "I spent years learning to disappear," she whispered, against his skin. "Now you ask me to appear completely." "I ask you to live, my dear," he corrected, his voice soft as silk. "By my side." When she opened her eyes, there was an answer in them. Not a spoken acceptance. Not yet, the dangers were too many. But a promise. The promise that she too was tired of disappearing. That her heart, which had learned the geography of waiting, was ready to draw a new map. It was all he needed. For now. Miss Bell returned, her step deliberate on the gravel. Samuel released Eleanor's hand, but the touch remained, imprinted on their skin, a mark that no distance would erase. The choice, though unproclaimed, had already been made. In the glances that crossed through crowded rooms, in the fleeting touch of fingers when passing a book, in the space of charged silence between their words, Eleanor had chosen to believe in the storm, and Samuel had chosen to be her safe harbour, not to imprison her, but to give her the courage to sail. It was after this furtive encounter that Eleanor returned to Berkeley Street with a glowing face and a light step. The lightness, however, evaporated as soon as she found Edmund waiting in the hall, arms crossed, his expression sombre. "You went out stealthily again," he said, not as a question, but as a statement laden with disapproval. "And he was with you." She stopped, adjusting her gloves. "Miss Bell was with me, Edmund. We were in a public place. There was nothing improper." "Impropriety is not the issue," he replied, stepping closer. His voice was low but intense. "The issue is safety and appearance. A young lady should never meet like this, alone with a man, even with a chaperone, without me or your stepfather knowing exactly where and with whom or being nearby." Eleanor felt a thread of irritation. "I am not a child in custody, and Samuel is a gentleman, a family friend. A gentleman who looks at you as if you were the only woman in the world," Edmund retorted, his brown eyes fixed on her, narrowing. "And that, Ellen, draws attention. The attention you cannot have. Not yet." She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I understand your zeal, Edmund, and I am grateful for it. But I promise, I will do nothing imprudent, nothing that puts me, Mother, Sir Reginald, or you at risk." He observed her for a long moment, his face a mystery of contained emotions. There was something there beyond simple brotherly care. A protective ferocity, yes, but also a deep assessment, as if measuring the distance she had travelled away from his reach. "Good," he finally said, his tone still grave. "Just remember, some people enter our lives like gentle breezes, others like storms. Make sure you know which one you are letting yourself be carried away by." He walked away, leaving her in the hall, her heart beating fast, and the uncomfortable feeling that Edmund saw more than she would like. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, her thoughts did not stay with her adoptive brother. They stayed with the man whose grey eyes promised storms that she secretly longed to face. Later at White's, the famous and exclusive gentlemen's club, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of business and politics. Samuel was at a card table with Henry, a game of whist that served more as an excuse for conversation than out of real interest in the game. "So father always knew," Henry said, lowering his cards, his face serious in the soft light of the lamps. "And never said a word." "To protect us," Samuel replied, looking at his glass of brandy. "I understand now, but that doesn't make the years any easier to swallow." "It never would," Henry agreed, "but it explains the silence, and it explains why you were never interested in any of the young ladies Mother introduced. You weren't being difficult, brother. You were being faithful." Samuel looked at his brother, surprised by the understanding. Henry, usually the most pragmatic and dry of the brothers, seemed to have matured into a silent insight. "Yes, but I am not at all liking the presence of young Mr. Fairchild surrounding her. That man—" Samuel tightened his jaw, clearly jealous, making Henry raise his eyebrows in clear amusement and surprise at the reaction of his usually peaceful brother. It was at that moment the lounge door opened and Edmund Fairchild entered with his imposing and austere posture. His gaze swept the room until it landed on them. Without hesitation, he headed for the table. "Speak of the devil," Samuel whispered, and his body tensed completely, causing him to adjust his upright posture in the chair as the man approached, staring at him with searching eyes. "Worthington," Edmund said with a brief nod, "and judging by the resemblance, you must be Henry." "Fairchild," Henry replied, slightly lifting the card he held in greeting. "Join us." Edmund pulled out a chair and sat down, bypassing any preamble. His brown eyes, usually mild, were cold and direct. "I will be clear," Edmund began, his words measured but laden with an intensity that made Henry slowly lower his cards. "I have known Miss Ellen Fairchild for some time now. I have seen the fear in her eyes more often than I would like. Fear of shadows, of footsteps behind the door, of letters with unknown seals. That fear is the legacy of the last few years, and I swore to myself and to Sir Reginald that I would do anything to keep the young lady safe, to give her a little peace." Samuel did not look away, remaining upright and completely impassive. He felt Henry's posture become alert beside him, but his attention was entirely on the man in front of him. "I understand your zeal, Fairchild," Samuel said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel beneath. "But you need to understand something about me and about her. We have a history that was abruptly interrupted and stolen from us by secrets and dangers that neither of us created. I would never do anything that brought the slightest shadow of danger to her, but I will also not stay away out of fear or protocol." He leaned forward, his grey eyes locking onto Edmund's with an intensity that made the air between them seem to vibrate. "I work with words and agreements. It is true. I am a diplomat. But if necessary," he continued, each word clear and cutting as a blade, "I would burn kingdoms so that she might be safe enough to show the world the singular beauty of her soul. She is like no other lady I have ever known. We have already been separated once by forces beyond our control. Now that I have found her, now that I know the truth, nothing and no one will separate us again." The declaration hung in the smoke of the air. Henry watched, motionless, a bit disconcerted by the ferocity in his brother's voice, which he had never heard before. Samuel finished, lower but no less intense. "If necessary, I would die so that she never had to feel fear again." Edmund held his gaze for long seconds, his face impenetrable. The tension at the table was like a rope stretched to its limit, a silent duel of wills and loyalties. Then something changed in Edmund's face, a slight relaxation around the eyes, an almost imperceptible nod of respect. He reached his hand across the table. "I like you, Worthington," Edmund said, his voice now less burdened, more open. "You have my permission to approach my sister." Samuel looked at the extended hand, then at Edmund's face. There was sincerity there. He shook the hand, the grip firm, man to man. "But," Edmund added, his tone serious again, "if you do anything that hurts her—" "I would rather die," Samuel interrupted softly, "than be the cause of a single one of her tears." Edmund held the grip for a second longer, his eyes evaluating the determination on Samuel's face. Then he released his hand and stood up. "Good," he said, a touch of approval in his voice. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a lady to court." Henry, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, frowned. "A lady? What lady?" Edmund turned to leave but cast a sidelong smile, a genuine and slightly mischievous smile that completely transformed his severe face. "Why, Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the beautiful English lady I intend to marry. Who else would it be?" And with that, he left, leaving the two Worthington brothers alone at the table, the echo of his words hanging in the air along with the cigar smoke. Henry slowly took the cigar from his mouth, looking at the door through which Edmund had exited, then at Samuel, a slow, knowing smile forming on his lips. "It seems, brother," Henry said, his voice laden with dry humor, "I was mistaken. It seems everyone has found their match this season." He took a puff. "I didn't know you were so jealous. I thought you were going to take his head off when he walked through the door." Samuel let out a sigh, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying leaving his shoulders. An involuntary smile touched his lips. "Ah, Henry, you have no idea what went through my head when I saw him hovering around Eleanor." He shook his head, relieved. "It seems the guard dog is indeed just a brother with excessive protective zeal." Henry laughed softly, a rare and warm sound. "It seems so, and it seems that you finally found your storm." Samuel looked at his brother, and for the first time in years felt completely understood. "I did," he confirmed, his voice soft, "and I have no intention whatsoever of seeking shelter." The confirmation that Edmund was not a rival but an ally, albeit a fiercely protective one, removed a final shadow from Samuel's mind. His determination now crystallized into action. He was no longer just the man who waited. He was the man who would act. And Eleanor in her bed that night, holding the book of sonnets and the yellowed paper, felt the same. The fear was still there, an ancestral whisper in the corners of her mind. But now it was eclipsed by something stronger, warmer, more vital, the certainty that she was not alone, that her heart, which had learned to beat in silence, had found its echo. She did not know what the future held. The dangers were real. Social conventions, a wall, the truth about her father, a double-edged sword. But for the first time she looked at all those things and did not see only obstacles. She saw choices, and in that moment, in the silence of her room, with the embroidered handkerchief he still carried over his heart, as alive in her memory as if it were in her hands, Eleanor Finch, Ellen Fairchild, made her choice. She chose to believe in the storm. She chose to believe in the man whose eyes promised not just shelter, but the vast, dangerous and glorious open sky. And, above all, she chose to remain in him who waited for her, and in her who always knew he would return. Samuel's office at the Foreign Office smelled of ink, old paper and urgency, piles of yellowed dossiers, some official, others obtained through channels that even Sir Reginald did not ask about, covered the desk. Maps of Europe with routes marked in red ink, records of ships setting sail from Naples under false names, and an intricate network of financial transactions, linking accounts in Zurich to a noble title in London. Everything pointed toward Lord Mortimer Blackwood. Sir Reginald Fairchild, sitting across from the desk with an untouched glass of whisky, observed Samuel with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You moved mountains in a week, Worthington, things that took me months to merely glimpse." Samuel did not look up from the report he was drafting, his pen moving with relentless precision. Mountains are merely accumulated earth. One only needs to know where to dig. He finally laid down his pen and handed the document to Sir Reginald. "Here, proof that Blackwood did not only betray diplomatic secrets during the Risorgimento, but embezzled funds from the British Treasury to finance militias against Italian unification. The murder of Lorenzo Finch was ordered to cover the embezzlement, not the idealism." Sir Reginald read, his eyes darkening. This is a powder keg." "It is justice," Samuel corrected, his voice cold. "And it is the key to Maria's inheritance in Scotland. With the Finch name cleared, The legal hurdles imposed by unknown influences vanish. The properties in Perthshire and the linked titles are hers and Eleanor's by right. Meanwhile, on Berkeley Street, Eleanor's life gained a new texture of normalcy and tension. Samuel's discoveries brought relief, but also a sense of imminent exposure. The threat of Blackwood, once a fuzzy shadow, now had sharp and dangerous contours. It was in this atmosphere that the Viscount and Viscountess arrived in London, alerted by their youngest son's sudden determination to unearth closed continental matters. The meeting at the Worthington townhouse in Marylebone was charged with a contained emotion that almost materialized in the air. Lady Worthington, upon seeing Maria Fairchild, still so graceful, but with hair now streaked with silver, held her hands for a long moment, her eyes shining. "Maria, my dear, you managed to keep her safe. Without your precious help it would not have been possible," Maria replied, her voice trembling with gratitude. "I shall never forget it." After an afternoon of cordial but emotionally charged conversation, Sir Reginald and Mrs. Fairchild took their leave of the Worthingtons, returning to Berkeley Street. In the entrance hall, Lady Worthington pressed Maria's hands with an intensity that spoke more than words, and Lord Worthington exchanged a significant look with Sir Reginald, a silent agreement between men who had guarded the same secret for years. As soon as the door closed, Samuel took a deep breath. The moment he had so long planned and feared had arrived. Without the Fairchild's presence, the weight of decorum lessened, but the truth to be told became even more naked and direct. "Mother, father, Simon, Henry," he began, addressing them in the great room, where the fire crackled cosily. "There is a declaration I must make." All eyes turned to him, each carrying a different expectation. Lady Worthington anxious, Lord Worthington pensive, Simon analytical, and Henry. Henry seemed to already know, a thread of familiar irony in his eyes. Samuel positioned himself before the fireplace, hands behind his back, his posture upright, that of a diplomat about to present a vital treaty. "I am going to ask for Eleanor Finch's hand in marriage," he announced, his voice clear and unwavering, echoing in the book-lined room. The silence that followed was dense. Lady Worthington brought her hand to her chest, her eyes welling up not with surprise, but with a deep emotion she tried to contain. Lord Worthington cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles, his face a study in contemplation. It was Simon the heir, always the most pragmatic, who spoke first. Straightening in his armchair, his face reflected the logical thinking that guided his life. "Samuel, you know I have the highest regard for you," Simon began, his tone measured. "But I must speak as the heir of this family and as your older brother. The young lady, while evidently refined and intelligent, the conversation about the translations of Ovid was revealing, carries a history, a complex one. The Finch name, after the events with her father, is still not fully absolved in the eyes of the world. Her Italian parentage, at a time of certain political tension with the continent, could be misinterpreted. A marriage under these circumstances would not only be a risk to your career at the Foreign Office, which is promising, but could cast a shadow over the entire family. There are other options, young ladies from impeccable families, with connections that could solidify our position, who— Simon. Samuel's voice did not rise, but it cut through the air with a coldness that made even the flames seem to waver. "I am not presenting a proposal for parliamentary debate. I am not asking for authorization. I am informing you of a decision made long ago, only delayed by circumstances beyond my control. No one, not you, nor the whispers of high society, nor the Foreign Secretary himself, will stand between Eleanor and me. What we have was hijacked once by secrets and fear. It will not be sabotaged again for social convenience." The ferocity contained in his words, the absolute determination in his grey eyes, made Simon recoil in his armchair, surprised. He was used to the reserved brother, the intellectual, not this man of iron will. Henry, who had observed the entire exchange with almost academic interest, let out an exaggerated sigh that broke the tension. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Simon," Henry said, his dry tone now tinged with unmistakable humour. "You sound like an etiquette manual that swallowed a financial report. Connections that could solidify our position?" He mimicked his brother's serious voice, making a theatrical gesture with his hand. "The lad isn't trying to negotiate a merger of estates. He is declaring that he has found the only woman on the planet who doesn't talk about lace, but about roots of meaning. It is frighteningly romantic and, I must say, a relief. I thought he was going to end up marrying a treaty on geopolitics. Lady Worthington could not contain a small, muffled smile. Lord Worthington hid a sigh behind his hand. Samuel looked at Henry, a silent gratitude in his gaze. The middle brother had always seen right, through him. Simon, for his part, seemed disconcerted by the comic intervention. He looked at Henry, then at Samuel, and slowly his rigid expression began to soften. He was not unfeeling. He was merely a man who carried the weight of a legacy. Henry has, as always, a peculiar talent for reducing complex matters to their essential elements, Simon said, rubbing his temple. He then looked directly at Samuel. You are truly determined in this, aren't you? To the very end. To the end. And beyond, Samuel affirmed without wavering. Simon observed him for a long moment, and something changed in his eyes. Pragmatism did not vanish, but it was tempered by a genuine respect. He stood up. Then listen to your older brother now, not as the heir, but as someone who saw you grow up. He approached Samuel. It is a difficult path you choose, more difficult than any I or Henry will face. Society will whisper, the envious will attack, but seeing the determination in your eyes today, Samuel, it is the same I saw in our father when he defended what was right, not what was easy. If this young lady is half the person who awakens such fierce loyalty in you, then she is remarkable indeed. Simon extended his hand. Samuel, somewhat surprised, shook it. You have my loyalty, brother, Simon said, his grip firm, and my support. Not in the ballroom, perhaps. There you are on your own. But in this house, and in anywhere that matters. I wish you happiness, and good luck. You will need both. Henry raised his glass of brandy in his hand. Hear, hear to my youngest brother, who finally discovered there are more important things than being the smartest man in the room, such as finding the woman who makes you forget you are in a room at all. And to poor Simon, who just realized he cannot save his brother from a scandal, but can at least stand beside him when he falls flat on his face in it. Cheers. The laughter that followed was a bit tense, but real. Lady Worthington wept, but now they were tears of relief and a kind of proud joy. Lord Worthington placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. Your mother and I have talked much about this in these last weeks, Lord Worthington said, his voice grave. We knew this day would come from the moment we heard you had found her again. Are you sure then, my son? I have been sure, Samuel replied, looking at his father, since the day a 10-year-old girl told me that a bad translation was like a dress that doesn't fit. The price has already been paid in years of separation. I will pay no more. Well, then, we approve with all our hearts. She has been part of your story for so long that it would be an injustice if she were not part of your future. The relief that flooded Samuel was so deep that for a moment he felt breathless. The fortress he had built around himself, of determination, of solitary resistance, cracked, revealing the vulnerability of the man who loved and only wanted to be allowed to love. Thank you, he managed to say, emotion choking his voice. He looked at each of them, his parents, Simon, Henry. This means everything. Henry raised his glass again, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Grand. Now that the dramatic family declaration is settled, may I ask the truly important question, when is she visiting us for dinner? I need to assess if the future Mrs. Worthington has enough of a sense of humor to put up with this family. I have my doubts, but I am willing to be surprised. And in that moment, in the warmth of the family circle, surrounded by the support he hadn't been certain he would have, Samuel felt that the final battle before happiness, the battle for acceptance, was won. The path ahead still had obstacles, but he would not face them alone. The declaration hung incontestable, but fate, as always, tested his resolve brutally. 2 nights later, Eleanor and Samuel were leaving a chamber music concert at the home of a friend of Sir Reginald. The night was cold, a damp mist enveloping the streets of Mayfair. The Fairchild carriage waited a few steps away. The coachman's head bowed against the cold. Miss Bell was already inside. Edmund, who had accompanied them, turned to say something to Samuel. It was then that they emerged from the mist, 2 fast, silent figures, men with common faces and dead eyes, short, glinting knives in their hands. Their target was clear. Eleanor! Ellen! Edmund shouted, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her back. But Samuel was already in motion. His years of fencing, of reflexes trained in tense diplomatic situations, acted before his brain could process the danger. He did not think of himself. He thought only of her cream dress, the same dress she had worn at the ball, stained with red. He interposed himself between her and the nearest attacker. There was a low, wet sound. A sharp, hot pain exploded in his side, below the ribs. The world spun, sounds muffled. Eleanor's scream, Edmund's roar, the sound of breaking glass, as Edmund hurled one of the men against a shop window. Samuel fell to his knees, one hand pressing the wound, the other still extended, as if he could keep her away from danger. His dark coat hid the red stain, but he felt his warmth leaking between his fingers. "Samuel!" Eleanor's voice was a torn lament. She knelt beside him, her hands trying to cover his, her face pale, as the moon against the dark mist. He tried to speak, to say he was fine, but only managed a raspy sigh. His eyes, however, remained fixed on her, conveying the only message that mattered. "You are safe." The attackers were overpowered by Edmund and the coachman, who had climbed down with a heavy staff. The sounds of approaching policemen echoed in the street. The rest was a blur of pain and muffled voices. He remembered being carried to the carriage, the pressure of Eleanor's hands on his, her eyes filled with a terror that perfectly echoed his own in the garden, years ago when she had vanished. Upon waking in his room at the house in Marylebone, with a doctor finishing stitching his wound, and the family gathered, his parents pale and silent, Sir Reginald and Maria at the foot of the bed with expressions of shock and guilt, Edmund with a face marked by cold fury, Samuel saw the final barrier crumble. Lady Worthington wept silently. Lord Worthington looked at his son with a new expression, no longer that of a father to a son, but of one man to another who had proven his worth on the most authentic field of battle. "He threw himself in front of her," Edmund said, his voice hoarse. Without hesitation, the man was 2 steps away. The intent was to wound her. Maria Fairchild brought her hands to her face. "My God!" Samuel, weak but lucid, turned his head. "Eleanor?" His voice was a thread of sound. "She is in the hallway," his mother replied, wiping her eyes. "She refused to leave. Miss Bell is with her." "Let her in," he asked, already buttoning his shirt to cover his wounded torso. No one objected. When Eleanor entered, her face was washed and pale, but her eyes were dry and burning. She ignored everyone in the room, went straight to the bed and knelt, taking his hand, the same hand he had extended in the museum. "You fool," she whispered, her voice laden with an emotion so deep it made his heart ache more than the wound. "You beautiful, brave, foolish fool." He smiled, a weak gesture. "I promise to protect you. I am a man of my word." It was in that moment, in the face of physical sacrifice and unquestionable devotion, that all residual resistance dissolved. The Worthingtons saw not just a romance, but a bond forged in the fire of danger and polished by the waiting. The Fairchilds saw not a convenient suitor, but a protector willing to die. The attack, though horrific, was the final catalyst. To threaten Eleanor was to awaken something primitive and implacable, not only in Samuel, but in everyone who loved her. A few days later, with Samuel still recovering but determined, the dossier was presented, not in an ordinary court, but in a closed hearing before a special committee of Parliament, composed of men Sir Reginald and Lord Worthington knew to be beyond reproach. Samuel, pale but impeccably dressed, presented the evidence with the logical clarity and calm eloquence that were his trademark. He named Blackwood, detailed the transactions, displayed the murder order against Lorenzo Finch with a forged official seal. As he spoke, he risked everything: career, reputation, his very future. Some of his superiors at the Foreign Office, whose careers were intertwined with the era of cover-ups that Blackwood represented, looked at him with silent disapproval. He saw it and ignored it. The truth, like a rock thrown into a stagnant pond, spread irreversible. Ripples. Lord Mortimer Blackwood was arrested at his estate before dawn. The scandal was contained, labelled as matters of state security, but the acquittal of Lorenzo Finch was public and formal. His name was cleared. His heroic but tragic defence of British interests was recognised. For Maria and Eleanor it meant more than justice. It meant freedom. The Scottish inheritance, previously blocked by Blackwood's legal manoeuvres, was released. Suddenly, Eleanor Finch was no longer the daughter of a fugitive traitor. She was the heiress of a respectable estate in Scotland and the daughter of a wronged hero. The shadow that had pursued them for a decade dissipated under the raw light of truth. On the balcony of the house in Marylebone, under a rare London spring sun, Samuel met with his parents and brothers. Simon, now looking at his brother with renewed respect, was the first to speak. "You did it, Samuel. And she is a remarkable young lady. The courage and love she has clearly shown throughout the entire episode." He shook his head. "I was wrong. You were being practical," Samuel said without rancor. "But love is rarely practical, Simon. It is necessary." Henry at his side smiled. "So says the man who nearly died to prove a point." Samuel touched his side, where the pain still throbbed, a physical reminder of his vow. "It wasn't to prove a point, Henry. It was to keep her alive. There is a difference." Lord Worthington placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your mother and I say are proud, not just for what you did, but for the man you are, and we give our full blessing to your marriage to Miss Finch, or Fairchild, whichever she prefers." It was the final piece of the puzzle to click into place. Acceptance complete and unreserved. Later, in the garden of Berkeley Street, under the shadow of a magnolia in bloom, Samuel found Eleanor. She wore a delicate moss-colored dress, in a beautiful hairstyle that left part of her dark locks loose, as in the old days. In her hands she held the book of sonnets. "It is all over," he said, not as a question. "It is over," she confirmed, a sigh of relief that seemed to come from her depths. "We are free." He approached, and this time there was no watchful Miss Bell, no protective Edmund, no shadow of danger lurking in the folds of the afternoon. There were only the two of them, and the sacred silence of the garden, and the vast and finally possible space of a future that no longer needed to be whispered, but lived. The late afternoon light gilded her hair, turned her light eyes into deep, tranquil waters. He stood before her, and for a long moment said nothing. He merely gazed at her, as he had in the library at 12, as he had by the lakeside or under the rain, or as he had gazed at her at the ball, each look a new layer of recognition, until this one, the deepest of all. Then he knelt, and he took her hands at once. His voice rose, low, clear, laden with an intimate solemnity that was theirs alone. "Eleanor," he began, and the name sounded like the first truth of his adult life. "Years ago, I gave you a piece of paper hidden between the pages of a master. In it, I wrote of secret maps and geographies of the heart. At that time, it was the only language I possessed to name what I felt, a love that was, above all, a recognition." He paused, his eyes tracing every feature of her face, like a man memorizing a beloved territory. "During all these years of separation, I navigated through seas of other people's words, treaties, speeches, laws, but the only lingua franca of my soul was always the silence we shared. That silence that is not empty, but full, as you taught me, full of the sound of things growing." He then extended his hands, palms up, a gesture of offering and vulnerability. She placed hers over his, and the touch was again like closing a circuit that had been open for a decade. "Now," he continued, his voice gaining a raspier, more emotional texture, "I no longer want to write about secret geographies. I want to trace a map with you together, a map of shared meanings, as you once said, where boundaries are defined not by empires or conventions, but by the extent of our curiosity for one another, where the only homeland is the space between one look and another." He gently squeezed her hands, his thumbs caressing her knuckles. "So, I ask you, not with the words of a diplomat, but with those of the man who learned to wait by listening to the silence. Would you walk with me, Eleanor, not as a refuge from the world, but as my partner to explore it? Would you be my wife, my partner in this strange and wonderful endeavor of living, not in the shadow of a stolen past, but in the clear and brave light of a future we will build, line by line, verse by verse, together?" The tears that filled Eleanor's eyes were not a flood, but a slow, warm overflow, like from a fountain long dammed. She did not cry from vague emotion, she cried from recognition. He had spoken in their language, in the language of maps of meanings, of precise translations, of silences that speak. She did not rise on her tiptoes immediately. Instead, she brought one of his hands to her lips and kissed the palm, in the same spot where he, years before, had sensed the texture of his future. "Samuel Worthington," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Laden with all the music he had so loved. You have spoken in verse your whole life, even when you thought you were writing in prose. A light, beautiful laugh mingled with her crying. And your proposal is the most perfect translation I have ever heard of everything I always felt but never knew how to dress in words. She released his hand only to place hers on his face, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched the line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth. The answer is yes, she said, and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was colossal. Yes to the maps, yes to the silence, yes to the light, yes to everything, because the only geography my heart accepts is the one that has you as its only, its true, north. It was then that she rose and he bowed, and the space between them vanished. The kiss was not a theft, nor a conquest. It was a mutual surrender, a sealing. It was sweet and deep, spoken in the language that only they mastered, the language of a patience that turned into passion, of a curiosity that became intimate knowledge, of a waiting that finally found its rest. When they parted, it was getting dark. The first stars dotted the sky above them. Eleanor leaned her forehead against his, her eyes closed, a deep and happy sigh escaping her lips. So this is how it is, she murmured, when the waiting ends. Samuel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, where the handkerchief embroidered by her still rested, now over the hearts of both. It does not end, he corrected softly, his voice a whisper against her hair. It merely transforms. From now on we will wait together, for the dawn, for the next word, for the rest of our lives. And there, under the growing mantle of the night, with the weight of the past finally lifted, and the future unfolding before them like a blank parchment, they knew. The story of Eleanor and Samuel was no longer a story about waiting. It was a story about beginning. The ceremony was not held at Westminster Abbey, nor at the great St. Paul's Cathedral. It took place in the small, ancient private chapel on Maria Finch's Scottish estate, now Eleanor's. The stone walls, witnesses to centuries, watched a singular gathering. Lord and Lady Worthington, solemn and misty-eyed, Simon and his wife, the practical and kind Caroline, Henry and his fiancée, the sensible Margaret, exchanging knowing glances. Sir Reginald Fairchild stood, imposing beside Maria, who held a delicately embroidered handkerchief. Edmund was there arm in arm with the radiant Lady Beatrice Ashworth, his smile free from the shadow of worry. The circle extended to a few close colleagues from the Foreign Office, men whose respect Samuel had earned not through titles, but through integrity. From Parliament came those who had helped bring justice to Lorenzo Finch. It was a microcosm of Eleanor's new world, not the seclusion of fear, but the web, woven by truth, loyalty, and love. Eleanor entered wearing the pearl-colored silk and delicate lace dress her mother had worn at her own wedding, tailored by the skillful hands of Miss Bell. There was no veil to hide her face. She wanted him to see her, and he did. Standing beside the ancient oak altar, Samuel felt every year of waiting dissolve the instant his eyes met hers and locked. They did not exchange standardized vows. They recited promises they had written together during nights spent planning the future, blending the language of treaties with that of poems. I promise to be your partner in the most important of negotiations, the building of a life. Where I am as rigid as Dryden's prose, bring your musicality. Where you lose yourself in the metaphors of the world, I will be your map of meanings, he said. I promise that our silence will never be loneliness, but the fertile ground where our greatest certainties will grow, and that all the geographies of my heart will forever have your name as their destination, she replied, her voice clear as a bell in the silent chapel. The priest declared them husband and wife. The kiss that followed was brief, sweet, and applauded by a circle of witnesses who knew the price of that happiness. The reception was intimate in the great hall of the manor house. There was music, moving speeches by Henry, irreverent, and Simon, surprisingly eloquent, and the couple's first dance. Samuel led her, with one hand firm on her back, the other interlaced with hers. They did not need to speak. Every step, every turn, every light pressure of their hands was a complete dialogue. It was the continuation of the waltz interrupted years ago, now danced without fear, without flight, under the approving eyes of those they loved. Later, When the last carriage had departed and the house sank into the cosy silence of the Scottish night and the guests were duly settled, Samuel and Eleanor finally found themselves alone on the threshold of their bridal chamber. The moon, full and silver, bathed the room through the high window. He took her by the hand and pulled her gently to the center of the room, where a fur rug seemed to capture the moonlight. "It seems we have finished the dance," she whispered, a shy smile on her lips. "No," he replied, his voice a low sound in the silence. "We have only changed the music." And without further words, he began to lead her in a slow, intimate dance, with no music other than what they created together. It was the choreography of final recognition. Their hands recognized each other's shoulders, the familiarity of presence, the quiet weight of her loose hair. Their eyes remained locked, reflecting silver lights and the deep universe that existed only between them. The dance led them from the window to the nest of silk, not with the urgency of an impulse, but with the solemnity of a ritual. It was the moment to finally translate in the silent language of the moment all the poems they had written across the distance. "Here," his breath said, as it found the small mole below her ear, "is the final period of my youthful poem." She, in turn, learned the texture of the scars he carried, the old one from a branch in the woods, and the new one still pink from the attack in the street. Her lips touched each one, not with pity, but with silent gratitude. They were marks of his history, of his courage, and now part of the map she called home. There was no rush. Time, which had been their jailer for so long, was now their ally, stretching out generously. They talked in whispers that were felt more than heard, completing sentences that had begun years ago in the summer library. "Remember the soapwort?" she murmured, her fingers interlaced with his. "The strong and delicate flower," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Like you." Their intimacy was not a storm that breaks, but the confident flow of a river finding its natural course after years of being dammed. It was a continuous dialogue, where a look was worth a paragraph, a sigh worth a confession, a kiss full of meaning worth an entire chapter of dissipated longing. When they finally fell asleep, entwined under the soft wool blankets, it was with the full peace of a beginning. The moon witnessed the instant when two people, two minds, and two souls who had learned to vibrate in the same silence finally found their shared rhythm, a rhythm that was not about possession but about surrender, not about filling a void but about celebrating a completeness that had always existed, waiting only for this moment to be named. Samuel wrapped his arm around her. His heart beat strong and steady against her back, a secure drum in the dark. "Eleanor," he whispered in her ear, the final word of that day, the first of an infinity. She squeezed the hand he held over her heart, her fingers interlacing with his. There was nothing left to say. All the poetry, all the waiting, all the promise was there, contained in the shared proximity, in the synchronized silence, in the perfect silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything. It was the end of the poem of waiting, and the first line, beautiful and eternal, of the poem of living. 5 years are nothing, and they are everything. They were grains of sand in the hourglass of eternity, but they were entire mountains of happiness, built upon the level ground of waiting. The house in Mayfair was not the largest in London, but it was the most lived in. Its walls did not hold the polished silence of parlours, but the echo of laughter, the passionate whisper of intellectual discussions after dinner, and the sweet chaos of small feet running through the hallways. On a particularly sunny Christmas morning, the winter garden teemed with life. 2 boys, Charles and Henrique, the latter an irreverent and very accurate tribute to Uncle Henry, aged 5 and 4, staged a naval battle with wooden boats in the ornamental pond, their strategic arguments surprisingly articulate for their ages. Beside them, little Sophia, only 3 years old, watched with a serious air, a children's botany book open in her lap, pointing occasionally at a bird or a flower and uttering its scientific name with perfect and disconcerting pronunciation. They were not alone. Their cousins, the children of Edmund and Beatrice, a couple who had found in her easy laughter the perfect antidote to his protective seriousness, played together in a cheerful jumble of voices. Edmund himself observed the scene from a garden chair, his face once marked by worry now relaxed into a quiet smile, his hand interlaced with Beatrice's. Inside, through the French window overlooking the garden, Samuel and Eleanor watched their offspring. Eleanor sat on Samuel's lap, her arms wrapped around his neck, her head leaning against his temple. Her hair, still the color of night, flowed over her shoulders, and her simple but elegant linen dress provided a domestic and intimate contrast to his impeccable attire, already dressed as if for morning service. "It seems Henrique is teaching Edmund's son siege tactics," Samuel commented, his tone dry but his eyes full of overwhelming tenderness. "Should I be concerned?" "Not at all," Eleanor replied. Her smile felt against his skin. "He is merely demonstrating that a good attack requires a strategic withdrawal to reallocate resources, or in garden terms, that it is better to hide the boat behind the rosebush before his cousin can catch it." Samuel laughed softly, the sound a comforting vibration in his chest. "Ah, yes, the old rosebush strategy. Sun Tzu would be proud." She turned to look him in the eye. The years had deepened the corners of his mouth, but softened that permanent furrow of his brow. He was a man at peace, a complete man. "You never asked me," she whispered, "if I missed my false name, if I missed Ellen." He studied her face, his expression serious. "I didn't need to ask. I see the answer every time someone calls you Mrs. Worthington, and you lift your head with quiet pride, not because of the title but because of the name that comes before it. Eleanor, the woman who no longer needs to hide." Tears of gratitude, those sweet and rare ones that still surprised her, glistened in her eyes. Sir Reginald and Samuel had done more than clear her father's name. They had returned to her the right to her own story. The Scottish inheritance, the lands in Perthshire, were competently managed and visited once a year on family trips that were more about creating new memories than reliving old ones. The fortune was security, not an identity. Her identity was there, in that house, on that lap, in those 3 prodigious little souls in the garden. "Sometimes," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion, "I look at all this, at you, at them, at this ordinary and extraordinary life we built, and I feel a jolt of fear, as if it were alone, as if the girl who whispered to the flowers in the Worthingtons' garden could never have dreamed of so much." He squeezed her tighter, his embrace a safe harbor against any ghost of the past. "It was not a dream, my love. It was a seed, planted in shared silence, watered by patience, and protected by truth. And look at what has bloomed." From the garden, Sophia let out a cry of triumph. "Papa, Mama, the Turdus marula has come for crumbs." The blackbird indeed pecked at cake crumbs near her feet. "The 3-year-old daughter who prefers the Latin of birds to common names," Samuel murmured, marveled and slightly stunned, as he always was whenever his daughter's peculiar genius manifested itself. "She is the most accurate translation of us both," Eleanor laughed. "She has your analytical mind and my ear for the music of things." The years had not been without challenges. There were the common pains of life, childhood illnesses, concerns about Samuel's career, which had flourished, making him a respected and sometimes feared name in the corridors of power, precisely for his unyielding integrity, the natural wear and tear of daily life. But they were shared challenges, and each one overcome was a new verse in the continuous poem of their union. At night, after the noisy and happy Christmas supper with everyone gathered, the Worthingtons, the Fairchilds, the siblings with their families, and the children finally asleep from exhaustion and joy, Samuel and Eleanor went up to their room. The moon, the same witness to their first night, bathed the floor in silver. He pulled her into a slow, silent dance in the middle of the room, as he had done so many times. "Do you know what today means?" he asked, his lips close to her ear. "The birth of hope," she replied instantly, knowing he did not refer only to the religious date. "Exactly. And today, looking at our table, at the faces of those we love, I feel that hope was not just born. It grew, bloomed, and bore fruit." She pulled back far enough to see his eyes. "It still frightens me, this happiness. It is so vast." "Do not be afraid," he whispered, sealing the promise with a soft and meaningful kiss that tasted of port wine and the comforting eternal weave of home. "I will be here to map it with you, forever." And so it was. The boy who had learned the language of waiting and the girl who listened to the silence of things growing had together written a new volume, no longer about absence, but about presence, not about secrets, but about shared truths. A book whose pages were ordinary days, illuminated by a love so deep and intelligent that it turned each one into a small masterpiece. The danger of the past was a story told by the fireside, a distant echo that no longer had the power to frighten. The future was Sophia's laughter, identifying a constellation, the strategic dispute of Charles and Henry, the touch of Samuel's hand finding hers under the table in the middle of a conversation. Eleanor Finch Worthington, leaning back beside her husband, listening to his quiet breathing and the soft sounds of the sleeping house, closed her eyes. And once more, after a lifetime of flight and caution, she felt not only safe, but radically gloriously free. To love, to be, to live. It was the end of the long, long waiting. It was the beginning of forever. And so, the secret geography of two hearts, traced in silence over years, became an open map, a territory of glances that no longer need words, of touches that are complete poems, of a love that learned the rarest language of all, that of intelligent patience. If you have come this far, if you have been with us through every stolen breath, every look laden with meaning, every verse hidden in the margins of a book, then subscribe to the channel, because here there will always be room for stories where desire is a whisper and love is a profoundly intelligent wait. Leave your like, turn on the bell so you don't miss any reunions, and share with someone who understands the beauty of a look that lasts a lifetime. Now, I would like to know, what was the moment of this story that remained etched in your silence? Was it the first meeting in the library, the reunion, the whisper, "I waited"? Tell me in the comments, because every great story lives not only in the one who tells it, but in the one who feels it. Until next time, and remember, some truths deserve to wait a lifetime. Others, like you, just need to be recognized.